They didn't swipe right. They swapped rosemary sachets, timed their stares like chess moves, and wooed with pork fat and poetry. Love in the Middle Ages wasn't dead, just dangerously weird. Tonight, we step into a world where eye contact was a felony, and flirting required herbal backup. Follow or subscribe the channel if you enjoy this kind of wild historical storytelling. In the grand romantic opera of human history, few acts are as bewildering or as unintentionally hilarious as medieval courtship. Forget dating apps, playlists, or dinner reservations. If you were a love-struck nobleman in the 14th century, your arsenal of seduction included a lute, a prayer, and possibly a fermented onion. You didn't just approach someone, you staged a multi-act theatrical production, complete with herbs, song, and fear of eternal damnation. Let's start with the eyes. In our age, eye contact is the warm handshake of romance. A brief glance, a shy look away, a lingering gaze, it's all coded communication. But back in medieval Europe, your eyeballs were loaded weapons. One wrong glance, and you weren't just risking embarrassment, you were risking social exile or a duel with someone's furious father. Holding a lady's gaze a second too long could be interpreted as anything from a marriage proposal to witchcraft, and neither outcome ended well. The manuals of courtly love, yes, these existed, laid out visual etiquette, as if they were drafting peace treaties between nations. Gentlemen were advised to gaze softly yet sincerely, a phrase that sounds more like a perfume ad than practical advice. The ideal stare hovered delicately between "I respect your embroidery" and "I swear I'm not about to invade your castle." It had to show admiration without desire, intent without presumption, passion without any actual emotional expression. Easy, right? Even worse, blushing was a major issue. A flushed cheek could signal romantic interest, or that you were drunk, or maybe dying of plague. Interpret that wrong, and suddenly your sweet gesture turned into a health hazard. If a lady blushed, men were instructed to immediately look away, cross themselves, and ideally leave town. It wasn't just about etiquette. The church viewed eye contact as a shortcut to temptation, a visual corridor to sin, possibly even gout, and nobody wanted gout on their conscience. Inside churches, eye contact was borderline illegal. Accidentally locking eyes with someone during Mass was the 14th century equivalent of DMing you up at 2 a.m. Scandalous. For noble women, whose lives were already a delicate balancing act between dignity and dowry, eye contact was combat. They trained to look mildly bored, vaguely annoyed, and entirely uninterested, the medieval version of ghosting. Yet, despite all this ridiculous choreography, love found a way. Across candlelit feasting halls and mud-caked market squares, hearts still leapt at forbidden glances. Troubadours wrote verses about eyes that burned like stars, which was poetic code for "she looked at me for more than 2 seconds." It was high drama, all rooted in something as simple and as dangerous as sight. Now, let's talk scent. You know that intoxicating mix of sandalwood and citrus from your favorite cologne? Medieval Europe had its own version. It was called "Smells Like Desperation and Mint." Hygiene was subjective. Soap existed, yes, but so did chronic shortages of clean water and a widespread fear that bathing could kill you. So how did lovers woo each other through the haze of sheep, sweat, and sin? Herbs. Herbs were everything. If you wanted to smell irresistible, you didn't splash on cologne, you raided your pantry. Sage, rosemary, lavender, not just for roasting chickens, but for seducing humans. Men would stuff sprigs of herbs into their sleeves, boots, or even their undergarments. As they strutted past a lady, their scent wafted like a medieval Axe body spray, whispering, "I may not bathe, but I care." Wealthier suitors upped the ante with pomanders, ornate metal balls filled with fragrant herbs, spices, and sometimes dried fruit. These were clipped to belts and swung like scent grenades, announcing, "I'm rich, I smell like oranges, and yes, I know how to read." Women weren't left out either. They tucked sachets of herbs into their corsets for fragrance, yes, but also as flea repellents. Nothing kills the mood like lice. Some guides even recommended rubbing herbs directly on your skin: basil for courage, mint for freshness, marjoram for, oddly enough, charm. One particularly ambitious 13th century romance guide insisted that rubbing thyme on your chest made your heart more visible. Interpret that however you like: poetic, anatomical, or just wildly unhelpful. But beware, not all scents were seductive. Garlic, for instance, was a double-edged sword. It signaled strength and vitality, sure, but also made you smell like you slept in a root cellar. And if your breath carried hints of beer and pickled fish, that wasn't a dating failure. That was just what breakfast smelled like in 1347. Then there was poetry. In our modern world, love poems are considered dramatic, maybe a bit cringe. In medieval Europe, they were romantic artillery, especially for nobles who had more access to ink than social grace. These poems weren't about personality or flirtatious banter. They were worshipful odes comparing your crush to the Virgin Mary, the ultimate medieval compliment, but also the ultimate romantic buzzkill. Imagine receiving a poem that says, "I burn for you, as one burns for holy martyrdom." Okay, thanks, but it worked. Courtly love required passion to be veiled in reverence. You didn't tell a lady she was beautiful. You said she was divine. You didn't confess desire. You pledged spiritual devotion. In other words, you got friend-zoned by theology. Still, people tried. They wrote sonnets, crafted songs, sent messages via messengers who might also double as plague carriers. They embroidered initials into handkerchiefs. They composed riddles and sang ballads under balconies. Sure, there were no dating apps, but there was no ghosting either. If someone ignored your poem, you didn't just feel hurt. You might actually die of heartbreak, or consumption, or both. This, then, was medieval romance, a dizzying cocktail of glances, herbs, and holy metaphors. It was part performance, part poetry, part pest control, a dance of danger and desire choreographed by fear, fantasy, and social rules so strict they'd make a dating coach cry. And yet, it worked. People found love. Amid plagues and pilgrimages, tournaments and taxes, they still locked eyes across crowded halls, still passed herbs under tables, still whispered half-spoken verses about eternal devotion. Because in the end, love has always been a little ridiculous and a lot brave. So next time your dating life feels confusing, take heart. At least you don't need a pomander, a chaperone, and 3 Latin prayers just to ask someone their name. And if you're enjoying this mad journey through history's weirdest romances, follow or subscribe the channel. More tales of love, lust, and lavender await. He compared her to an angel, then a church relic, then a spice rack. She replied with a poem and a property appraisal. Welcome back to the world where love rhymed with righteousness and flirtation smelled like soup. If you're enjoying the absurd charm of medieval love, follow or subscribe the channel, because there's a lot more passion, poetry, and parsnips where that came from. Medieval love was many things: poetic, spiritual, pest-infested, but above all, it was deeply religious. Not necessarily because people were brimming with holy virtue, but because no one wanted to be excommunicated for catching feelings. Love had to be baptized, blessed, and ideally expressed in iambic pentameter with a hint of incense. The church wasn't just the spiritual heart of the community, it was the romance police, quietly monitoring your metaphors and frowning at your stanzas. So, when a medieval suitor reached for a quill, he wasn't just writing to woo, he was composing a theological thesis with a crush. The result? Lines like, "O lady, purest of light, thy gaze more sacred than sacred right." Sounds sweet, until you realize he just compared your eyes to a baptismal font. It was the kind of compliment that made you question whether you were being courted or canonized. This trend led to one of the strangest love letter genres in history, the holy romantic hybrid. It left recipients genuinely confused. Is this a marriage proposal or a devotional hymn? Should I feel flattered or prepare for a convent? One poet famously addressed his muse as, my angel of chaste delight, which, even by medieval standards, was code for, I love you, but also please don't touch me ever. To further complicate the situation, nobles weren't even writing their own verses half the time. Enter the troubadours, professional heartbreakers with lyres and legal deniability. These traveling bards specialized in flirtation by proxy, crafting lyrics that praised a woman's grace, virtue, and moral standing, while studiously avoiding any hint of sinful intent. It was romance with all the risks stripped out, a serenade that might be interpreted as romantic, or merely deeply appreciative of your embroidery skills. Medieval sexting? Try 27 stanzas of I admire your virtue from afar. It was like whispering sweet nothings through the book of Psalms, safe, pious, and legally ambiguous. But don't be fooled, women weren't passive recipients in this poetic exchange. Many noble women, literate and just as witty, responded with verses of their own, and theirs often cut through the incense and Latin with remarkable clarity. I admire your courage, your manners, and the fact that you own land. Now that's a woman with her priorities straight. Romance may have been wrapped in metaphor, but real estate was eternal. Still, poetry offered a rare loophole for affection. Wrapped in rhyme, spiced with scripture, and cloaked in plausible deniability, a poem could confess everything and nothing all at once. If the object of your affection swooned, great. If not, well, it was clearly just a religious allegory. That line about her lips like rose petals? Obviously a reference to divine creation. That verse about eternal yearning? A metaphor for salvation. And if you quoted a psalm in the last stanza, congratulations, your entire love letter was now protected by ecclesiastical ambiguity. But the medieval romantic didn't stop with ink. Oh no, he seasoned his affection. Literally. Love, you see, wasn't just a thing you wrote, it was a thing you smelled. And in a world where most people reeked of turnips, leather, and mild existential dread, that mattered. So before you sent off your saintly sonnet, you marinated it in cloves, sprinkled it with cinnamon, and maybe even dusted it with nutmeg, provided you weren't hoarding it for mulled wine or warding off the plague. This wasn't just about making your parchment smell nice. Each spice carried symbolic weight. Cinnamon was passion. Cloves meant devotion. Saffron? That was the medieval equivalent of showing off your designer shoes, exotic, expensive, and guaranteed to scream, I'm rich, please love me. A scented letter was the whole package. Emotional, theological, and olfactory. Some lovers took it even further, pressing dried petals between the folds of the paper. Violets for modesty, rosemary for remembrance, marjoram again with the marjoram for charm. And if you were feeling bold, fennel. Though that backfired more often than not. Unless your lady was a salad, fennel read more as culinary critique than carnal yearning. In wealthier circles, love letters became elaborate sensory experiences. The scroll might be soaked in rosewater, infused with musk, and sealed with perfumed wax. That wax would be stamped with the sender's family crest, a sort of emotional notarization, like I, Sir Gregory of whatever, do hereby declare my chaste desire. When your declaration of eternal devotion hit someone's nose like a floral battering ram, you knew you'd done it right. But as with everything in the medieval world, moderation was a myth. Some letters were so heavily seasoned they triggered sneezing fits. Others were mistaken for medicine, spell scrolls, or rodent bait. One poem, drenched in so much honey and spice, allegedly attracted a small army of mice during its cross-country journey. Picture that. Your tender words of love nibbled into oblivion by rodents before they ever reached your muse. Romance was risky business. And it wasn't just herbs and verses. The grand romantic gesture in medieval Europe often involved dead animals. Yes, really. Nothing said, I am brave, masculine, and emotionally repressed, like gifting your beloved a freshly killed pheasant, or a rabbit, or if you were truly ambitious, a boar's head. These trophies weren't dinner. They were metaphors. The implication was clear. I ventured into the woods, stared death in the face, and brought back this woodland creature because you haunt my dreams and I have unresolved childhood trauma. A woman receiving such a gift was expected to be flattered, not repulsed. If she smiled and accepted it, congratulations, she might one day agree to share your sheep-infested estate. Of course, like everything else in medieval love, these gifts came with codes. A pheasant symbolized gallantry. A deer suggested grace. A hare, fertility. A skinned hedgehog probably meant, I panic under pressure, and forgot to buy roses. Some knights even presented blood-stained weapons as tokens of devotion. This dagger pierced a brigand. Now it's yours. How charming. Yet beneath the blood and spices and poetic gymnastics, there was real feeling, genuine longing. People were fumbling for connection in a world of rigid rules and spiritual landmines. They took risks not just with their hearts, but with their reputations, their safety, their spice cabinets. And somehow, it worked. Lovers found each other between the lines of holy rhymes and under the perfume of parchment. They courted, committed, even sometimes married for love, a radical concept when marriages were often economic treaties wrapped in linen. For every overcooked stanza and over-scented scroll, there were hearts genuinely moved, futures quietly forged. So, next time you're staring at your phone, debating whether to send a text or a voice note, take comfort. At least you're not drying marjoram petals, oiling wax seals, and hiring a wandering bard with an excellent rhyming dictionary. Modern love may be messy, but it's a lot less likely to involve plague, poultry, or poetry that confuses you with the Virgin Mary. Still want more tales of over-the-top romance, scented scrolls, and tragically romantic poultry? Follow or subscribe the channel. We're just getting started. He didn't bring flowers. He brought a steaming boar's head still dripping. She didn't blush. She politely accepted her fourth rabbit of the week. Welcome back to an era where dating meant dead animals, decorative shoes, and dangerously flammable flirtation. If this delightful descent into romantic absurdity has your heart racing or your curiosity piqued, follow or subscribe the channel. Trust me, it only gets more wonderfully ridiculous from here. In a time when candlelight wasn't a romantic choice but a necessity, and when public sanitation was more of a theory than a practice, love was expressed not through cuddly gestures or moody playlists, but through the generous gifting of recently slain wildlife. That's right. While modern romantics agonize over whether to send flowers or texts with just the right number of emojis, their medieval counterparts wooed their sweethearts with steaming animal carcasses, preferably still bleeding. Because nothing said, I yearn for you, like a decapitated boar with excellent presentation. It wasn't weird. In fact, it was expected. According to 14th century chivalric traditions, a man's desirability could be directly measured by his ability to chase, maul, and flamboyantly present an animal he had just defeated in hand-to-hoof combat. If you were a knight who could wrestle a stag to the mud, hoist its antlers triumphantly, and plate them with silver, congratulations, you were officially a sex symbol, the medieval Ryan Gosling, but with more fur and fewer feelings. The women, of course, were socially conditioned to respond with delighted admiration. Whether they were receiving a brace of doves, a gutted hare, or a freshly plucked swan, which may or may not have violently resisted capture, etiquette demanded polite enthusiasm. Even if internally they were thinking, wonderful, another festering duck. Where do I even store this one? Not all these animal tokens were random, mind you. Each creature carried meaning. A swan stood for purity and grace, provided it hadn't tried to bludgeon anyone with its wings on the way in. Falcons were power gifts, literally and figuratively. Gifting a trained falcon said, I am noble, I am rich, and I trust you with this bird that might remove your finger. High-risk romance, high reward. For those lower on the social ladder, options got smaller. Hedgehogs, ferrets, the ever-popular rabbit. One lovesick baker once tried to impress a miller's daughter with a duck. Unfortunately, the duck escaped mid-presentation, flew into the family's well, and turned their water supply into a protein smoothie. That courtship never recovered. But if you really wanted to impress, you didn't stop at furry foreplay. You staged an entire ritual, the ceremonial deer presentation. Picture it a full roasted deer, glistening, steaming, dragged dramatically into a grand hall as musicians strummed lutes and poets extolled your rugged virtues. The lady of your affection sat poised, surrounded by family, courtiers, and at least 4 other women silently judging the venison. You bowed, offered the deer in her honor, and everyone pretended this wasn't deeply awkward. Of course, this entire plan unraveled if the lady in question was vegetarian, had a weak stomach, or just didn't like surprises that involved antlers. There's no recorded etiquette for what to do if she screamed at the sight of roasted eyeballs, but we assume the knight just quietly retrieved his deer and reconsidered his romantic strategies. Still, for many, the gesture was everything. In a world without casual hangouts or swiping right, a dead animal tied with ribbon and delivered with a poem meant something clear. I risked disease, bear attacks, and forest curses, and the entire time I was thinking of you. And if you weren't lucky enough to bag a wild animal, you pivoted to compliments. But even that came with landmines. Compliment her beauty? Too forward. Mention her lips? Practically criminal. Admire her hair? Scandalous. It was likely hidden under 3 veils, a head wrap, and the divine protection of 2 saints. In such a perilous environment, where could a man safely aim his affections? Her shoes? Yes, shoes. In the tangled wilderness of medieval modesty, complimenting footwear was the romantic loophole. A well-timed, "My lady, your shoes are most finely pointed," could make a lady's heart flutter, or at least her eyebrow raise. In a society where ankle exposure was racy and spiritual reputation was everything, a sincere nod to someone's footgear was practically a love letter. And these weren't just any shoes. The medieval fashion elite adored Poulain's pointed shoes so long and impractical they had to be tied to your knees to prevent catastrophic tripping. Women who glided effortlessly in these medieval stilettos were seen as paragons of poise and femininity. Complimenting her shoes was saying, "I notice your elegance, your control, your ability to not fall into a moat while dressed like an ornamental statue." There's actual advice, recorded in a 13th century etiquette manuscript, that says, and I paraphrase, "Greet a lady with praise for her hem or her step, but let not thine eyes travel higher than her ankle, lest you bring shame." In simpler terms, flirt with the feet, lest your soul be damned. Women could flirt back carefully. A lady might compliment a man's boots, particularly if they were made of fine Italian leather or didn't reek of sheep and despair. Saying, "Your boots are noble," was really just medieval for, "You look financially stable, and I appreciate that." In a world of arranged marriages and questionable hygiene, that was as close to a flirty emoji as you could get. There were, of course, risks. Foot-focused flirting could go too far. Praise too frequently and you looked obsessed. Praise too seldom and you looked disinterested. The sweet spot was somewhere between, "That is fine stitching," and "I would die for those soles." There was no manual, only trial, error, and a lot of painfully long shoes. And yet, amid the awkward stares, steaming animal tributes, and foot-centric compliments, love still bloomed. It bloomed in the stilted lines of rhyme-heavy letters, in shared glances from beneath hoods, in deer banquets and sachets of rosemary tucked inside corsets. It wasn't easy, it wasn't supposed to be. It was hard-won, codified, and dipped in irony. But it was real. Because even under layers of fur, fear, and feathers, hearts were still reaching for each other. They just did it while holding dead rabbits and quoting psalms. So, if your modern dating life feels exhausting, if you're wondering whether that text was too much, or if you should have waited another hour before replying, remember the baker and his duck, the knight and his deer, the girl who smiled politely while holding her 3rd ferret of the week. And take comfort. At least, you don't have to learn falconry just to ask someone to coffee. Want more tales of courtship rituals gone wild, fashion-forward flirtation, and edible declarations of love? Follow or subscribe the channel and bring your finest shoes. He complimented her shoes. She smiled. 2 goats, a vineyard, and 1 moon cycle later they were married. Romance didn't just need timing, it needed star charts, powdered deer hearts, and the occasional enchanted biscuit. Welcome back to a time when love meant risking tooth rot, goose attacks, and excommunication just to hold someone's gaze. Still here? Follow or subscribe the channel where history's weirdest courtship rituals come wrapped in sarcasm, steam, and star-aligned spice. In a world teetering between religious dread and rampant imagination, where courtship could get you a bride, a duel, or a one-way ticket to confession, sometimes the only safe compliment was aimed squarely at the ground, literally. Complimenting a lady's shoes, yes, her shoes was a widely accepted declaration of romantic interest. Not her eyes, not her hair, which was usually hidden under an elaborate head wrap the size of a picnic basket, but her footwear. And it wasn't just practical. A well-timed observation like, "Your poulains are finely made," could say volumes. Translated from medieval flirtish, it meant, "I see you. I find you graceful. And I'd like to speak more before my father marries me off to a stranger with 6 cows and an unfortunate overbite." If she smiled back or nodded, even subtly, that wasn't just a good sign. That was practically a legally binding proposal. There's actual documentation of such exchanges. One charming dialogue reads, "Your shoes are finely made and your cloak is well stitched." 2 months later, they were married. 5 goats and a vineyard sealed the deal. That was the medieval version of sliding into someone's DMs, only with livestock clauses and local musicians narrating your progress. So yes, in the labyrinthine rituals of medieval love, the safest, sweetest, and probably strangest way to say, "I'm into you," was by praising someone's shoelaces and praying the stars were in your favor. Literally. Because romance wasn't just a game of charm or timing, it was an astrologically approved crusade. According to multiple medieval love manuals, and yes, there were enough to stock a decent bookstore, declaring your feelings wasn't about seizing the moment, it was about consulting the heavens. Want to confess your love? Better check the moon phase. Thinking of holding her hand? Not unless Jupiter is behaving. Want to give her a fennel-infused rabbit? You'd better ask the stars first. A waxing moon, that's the one getting larger, not the one you stare at while emotionally compromised, was seen as auspicious. Symbolic of growth and strength, it was the ideal time to drop your poetic truth bombs, especially if you could do so under moonlight, while holding something symbolic like a rose or a gently maimed dove. But woe unto the soul who tried confessing during a waning moon. That's the shrinking one. And according to celestial logic, anything begun during a waning moon would slowly decay like love, soup, or that weird friendship you had with your dentist. If you tried to woo someone during this phase and were rejected, astrologers wouldn't even flinch. "Ah, yes," they'd nod gravely. Clearly, Mercury disapproved. And it got worse. Full moons were risky. They were thought to bring out strong emotions and possibly lycanthropy. Eclipses? Absolutely not. If you proposed during an eclipse, people might start blaming you for poor harvests and nearby hauntings. One particularly grumpy 14th century monk, who we assume had not gotten laid in several decades, warned that confessing love during a new moon would cause spiritual confusion, tooth rot, and the wrath of St. Agnes. Naturally, someone did it anyway. He was later bitten by a goose. Coincidence? The medieval mind said no. It was fate. These beliefs weren't confined to cabbage farmers and suspicious peasants. Nobles had astrologers on speed dial. Whole marriages were delayed sometimes for months because Venus was in a bad mood. Flirting across a banquet hall? Better make sure Mars isn't in retrograde or you might accidentally start a feud instead. One lord reportedly ghosted his own engagement based on a planetary misalignment. The stars, he insisted, were not yet ready for him to feel things. Of course, the sky also made a convenient excuse. "I do like you, Lady Beatrix, but Mercury is drunk and Saturn is throwing shade. Perhaps next season." Honestly, that's more poetic than ghosting someone with 3 dots and no follow-up text. But if astrology wasn't your flavor, there was another route. The bubbling, bizarre world of medieval love potions. These were the Tinder boosts of the 13th century, except with more deer organs and fewer privacy policies. Because when emotional repression and social stratification make honest communication impossible, why not just trick someone into loving you with magical soup? Love potions were serious business. Recipes floated around herbalist shops, monasteries, and the homes of slightly unhinged women with too many dried frogs in their pantry. One popular brew included honey, basil, and powdered deer heart, which sounds romantic until you consider the logistics of acquiring deer heart and turning it into powder. Other recipes called for wine, rose petals, cloves, and sometimes hair, burnt hair, voluntarily ingested. Some potions were meant to be sipped, others were dabbed onto clothes or smuggled into food. A few were buried under doorways or sewn into undergarments, which makes for very intense laundry days. One particularly bold potion required boiling graveyard dirt with lavender and chanting Latin over the steam. Another demanded black cat fat, though thankfully, most recipes specified symbolic fat and not actual cats. We hope. The ultimate goal? To make someone fall for you. Whether it worked was questionable. Most results fell into one of three categories: nausea, hallucinations, or spontaneous poetry. Sometimes all three. Still, the belief was powerful. If you thought you were under a spell, you often acted like you were. Much like how modern humans behave after a couple glasses of Chardonnay and a Taylor Swift playlist. But society took these brews very seriously. Courts prosecuted potion makers for bewitching noblemen. One hilariously defensive baron insisted he had not fallen in love. He had been bewitched by her rosemary. Of course, Harold. It was the seasoning, not her personality. These potions weren't all nonsense. Many used herbs known to affect mood and sensation: lavender, cinnamon, wine, and basil. Others, less so. One infamous potion involved mixing ashes of fingernails with goat milk and whispering your beloved's name into the pot 3 times at dawn. Romantic? Only if your idea of seduction includes mild necromancy. Still, it was an understandable impulse. In a world with no casual dating, no DMs, and a constant threat of being married off to someone who owned adjacent farmland, love felt like war. Why not give yourself an edge? Stir the pot, charm the stars, spritz your parchment with cloves, and shoot your shot, even if that shot came laced with marjoram and moral ambiguity. Because despite the ridiculous rituals, the superstitions, and the livestock-heavy love letters, people genuinely fell for each other. They risked reputation, embarrassment, and gastrointestinal trauma for a chance at connection. And when the timing was right, whether by stars, spells, or shoe compliments, it worked. So, if you're sitting there agonizing over whether to text hey or hi, just remember, somewhere, 700 years ago, a man complimented a shoe, whispered to the moon, and fed his soulmate a charm-infused biscuit, and it somehow led to 5 kids and a castle. Follow or subscribe the channel for more tales of cosmic timing, enchanted bread, and the ongoing quest to understand how anyone ever got married in the Middle Ages. He stared too long, you wrote a sonnet, or started a sword fight. No in between. Romance wasn't just tender, it was armored, bruised, and sometimes bleeding from the face. Tonight, we enter a world where love wasn't love unless it required stitches. If you're enjoying this unhinged historical love story, don't forget to follow or subscribe the channel for more tales where passion meets passive-aggressive poetry and the occasional joust-induced concussion. In the medieval mind, love was not a soft thing. It was chivalrous. It was ritualized. It came with armor and often required a second to hold your helmet while you challenged your rival to single combat. Because in that strange, noble, obsessed world of courtly affection, romance wasn't just a matter of the heart, it was a matter of honor and dented helmets. Let's say you caught a man gazing at your beloved, not saying anything, not winking, just gazing, a moment too long. In the modern era, this might be the spark for an awkward conversation or a jealous Instagram story. But in the 14th century, that man had insulted your honor, your house, and possibly your horse. The only civilized solution was either to write him a deeply veiled poem laced with barbed metaphor, or to slap him across the face with a glove and start picking weapons. Most chose the glove. Faster results, more blood, more style. This was chivalry in action. That famous, shiny, idealistic code of knightly conduct that emphasized honor, bravery, and dramatic overreaction. If a lady's virtue was even vaguely, hypothetically, or symbolically impugned, even if she hadn't noticed, didn't care, or actually made eye contact first, a knight was expected to rise, remove his hat, if he could get it off with his gauntlets, and say something like, "Sir, you have insulted my lady's virtue with thine eyes. Prepare thy spleen." This was followed by duels. Some were elaborate tournaments, sanctioned by lords, refereed by scribes, cheered by peasants. Others were spontaneous free-for-alls that ended in a horse trough or with someone using a turkey leg as a weapon. Not all duels were to the death. The point wasn't necessarily to kill, just to prove you were willing to try, because nothing says "I love you" quite like tetanus. For the women caught in the middle of all this gallantry, it was a mixed bag. Flattering? Sure. Exhausting? Absolutely. You couldn't buy onions in the marketplace without sparking a small sword fight over your ankle ribbons. Some women tried to de-escalate the constant tension by claiming poor eyesight. "Oh no, I wasn't admiring the squire's jawline, I was just distracted by the cabbage cart." And let's be honest, not all duels were about love. Some were political. Some were over land. Some were because someone pronounced another man's name with the wrong emphasis on the second syllable. But when romance was involved, the stakes always felt higher, because behind every bleeding knight was the hope of a kiss, a glance, or at the very least, a handkerchief. Which brings us to one of the most iconic symbols of knightly affection, wearing her colors. This wasn't metaphorical. It was actual fabric, a token from the lady herself, tied proudly to the knight's armor before he marched off to war, or worse, a jousting tournament. It could be anything: a ribbon, a veil, a piece of lace. The meaning was clear: I fight for her. Also, I look fabulous in blush pink. It wasn't just romantic, it was political. Wearing a noblewoman's token could boost a knight's status, attract patronage, or earn him extra loaves of bread from the castle kitchen. But there was a catch. You had to make it look dignified. Difficult when your chosen token was an entire embroidered sleeve fluttering from your elbow like a medieval windsock. Some knights went all in. One was recorded wearing a garter tied around his helmet, bold, romantic, and tragic when it slipped over his eyes mid-joust and nearly caused a fatal collision. Others sported embroidery, scented with lavender and blessings. Little stitched notes like, "To my champion," or "Try not to bleed again," were the sticky notes of the era. Practical, heartfelt, and mildly passive-aggressive. Color choice mattered. Red meant passion. Blue meant loyalty. Green was complicated. Depending on the region, green symbolized hope, fertility, or the deeply awkward implication that your lady might be exploring other options. Interpreting it wrong could land you in a duel with her second favorite knight. Naturally, critics of the trend scoffed. "You look like a mobile laundry line," they said. "That's not a dagger, that's a curtain tassel." These critics were also single. Coincidence? Doubtful. And what if you weren't a knight? What if you were just a love-struck commoner with no armor, no squire, and only moderate access to swords? Enter the serenade. In the days before texts, voicemails, or anonymous playlists, the most romantic thing you could do was stand beneath someone's window at night, clutch your lute, and pour your heart into a slightly off-key ballad while praying her father wasn't a violent man with excellent hearing. Serenading was considered one of the noblest expressions of love, second only to not dying in battle. A well-crafted song, sung under starlight, could melt the iciest heart, or at least score you a nod at church. The key word here, though, is well-crafted. Most medieval suitors were not trained musicians. They had lutes, awkward pear-shaped instruments that looked like someone glued a spoon to a gourd, but little idea how to use them. Medieval melodies weren't catchy. They didn't have pop hooks. They didn't rhyme the word love with above. Instead, they consisted of long, winding verses about roses, sorrow, and God's divine mercy, often sung in Latin to a sheep. But when it worked, it worked. One night's midnight ballad allegedly moved a lady to tears, and later, marriage. Another man's poorly tuned serenade startled the family dog, which bit him. Results varied, but the risk was part of the appeal. You were exposing your soul, your voice, and your dignity, all in one brave moment beneath a window. Of course, serenades weren't always spontaneous. Some were planned elaborate performances with backup lutes, borrowed poetry, and mood lighting, which in this case meant torches that occasionally set haystacks ablaze. Others were more accidental. There's a charming story of a man who got drunk on mead, forgot the lyrics, and ended up singing his shopping list. Somehow, she still married him. Because despite all the pageantry, what really mattered was the gesture, the courage to be foolish, the willingness to look ridiculous. Whether it was wearing lavender on a battlefield, dueling a stranger over a glance, or singing through the sniffles in a cabbage-scented alley, love required bravery, and maybe a helmet. So the next time you hesitate before sending that message, remember this. Medieval lovers crossed moats, dodged swords, wore embroidered socks on their heads, and sang through cracked voices, all to say, I see you, I like you, I'll fight an entire village for you. If that's not romantic, what is? And if you want more tales of chivalric chaos, lovesick nights, and ballads sung to sleeping dogs, follow or subscribe the channel. We're only halfway through the madness. He sang under her window. His voice cracked. His mandolin exploded. She responded with a ribbon or a chamber pot. Because in medieval dating, you either won hearts or you got rinsed with regret. If this saga of lute-tuned longing and herbal seduction makes you smile or wince, follow or subscribe the channel. We're not just dissecting history, we're serenading it badly under the moonlight. Let's take a moment to feel for the medieval suitor. He didn't have a playlist, a DM, or even a shower. What he did have was a mandolin, chronic optimism, and a song so emotional it could crack stone or his own vocal cords. Midnight serenading wasn't just a tradition. It was the medieval equivalent of shooting your shot while praying the entire village wasn't listening. Love poems were the bread and butter of serenading, often literally, since some of them sounded like someone choking on bread. The lyrics were always dramatic, always star-soaked, sometimes in Latin to sound pious, sometimes in French to sound expensive, and occasionally in a regional dialect that made even cows tilt their heads in confusion. One heroic and mildly tragic case involved the baker's son from Rouen. Armed with a borrowed mandolin and a voice full of ambition, he took to the cobbled street under his beloved's window. On verse 2, his voice cracked. On verse 3, the mandolin cracked. On verse 4, her father cracked, and the serenade ended with a bruised ego and a stern warning from local authorities. Still, he tried. And in the medieval world, trying was half the battle. Ladies, meanwhile, were expected to respond with poise and grace. Laughing was strictly frowned upon, even if the melody resembled a dying goat and the performance could summon rain out of pity. The proper etiquette was to peek out through the shutter, drop a token of encouragement, maybe a flower, a ribbon, or, in particularly enthusiastic cases, a polite cough of approval. And sometimes it worked. A half-decent melody, warbled under moonlight, with enough sincerity and not too much mead, could warm even the coldest noble heart. Other times, your reward was a full chamber pot emptied from the window. Romantic? Not quite. Effective? Extremely. That was medieval feedback, immediate, direct, and often damp. Still, to the medieval mind, serenading was noble, heroic even. It showed courage, vulnerability, a willingness to risk both embarrassment and sanitation. And if your only audience was a startled owl and an unimpressed cat, so be it. Love demanded performance. But music alone wasn't enough to charm a potential partner. You had to smell like love, too. And when soap was rare, water was optional, and your average person smelled like boiled sheep and existential dread, people got creative. Very creative. Enter the herb face. Yes, medieval dating advice, actual advice, preserved in earnest scrolls and herbals, often recommended that you rub fragrant greenery on your face. Want to be desirable? Smear yourself with basil. Want to win hearts? Try marjoram. Want someone to remember your name and not the smell of your boots? Dab some rosemary across your temples. The idea was simple. Smell nice, look vaguely dewy, and someone would eventually fall in love with you, or at least not faint in your presence. Men were told to crush herbs into pastes and apply them along their jawlines, like some early version of contouring with pesto. Women often infused herbs into water and dabbed them on like 14th century toner. Imagine arriving at a feast with parsley oil trickling down your neck and thyme stuck to your eyebrows like confetti. Delightfully herbal, alarmingly moist. The guides didn't stop there. One confidently declared, "A man should bathe his visage in mint at sunrise, that he may appear pleasing unto all." Lovely thought. But what if you lived in a hut, owned no mint, and hadn't seen sunrise since last equinox? Then you did what everyone else did. You made do with whatever didn't attract rats. The rich had options: rosewater, saffron, sandalwood. These weren't just fragrances, they were social signals. If you smelled like anything other than goat stew, people assumed you were doing well. Meanwhile, the poor muddled together garlic, onions, and desperation. Less seduction, more salad bar. Interestingly, this passion for aromatic attractiveness gave rise to an entire economy. Apothecaries sold love salves, mysterious red pastes that claimed to make the user irresistible to the gaze and nose. Side effects included sneezing, dizziness, and accidental goat attraction. But hey, at least you were trying. Because that's what counted, the effort. In a world where saying, "I love you," outright, could get you slapped, sued, or spiritually condemned, everything had to be subtle, safer, symbolic. Which brings us to the greatest cryptic romance language of them all, flowers. Welcome to the botanical code of medieval courtship, where every bloom carried secret meaning, and your garden path doubled as a romantic landmine. Why risk scandal with words when you could say, "I burn for you," with the right combination of petals? Roses, of course, were the heavy hitters. Red meant passion. White meant purity. Pink meant affection. Violet, modesty. Lily, virtue. Lavender, that complex scented whisper of, "I want to flirt, but let's not summon the Inquisition." Composing a bouquet became an emotional Sudoku. Want to confess desire while maintaining plausible deniability? Combine columbine, for foolishness, with carnations, for fascination. Need to apologize for accidentally calling her by her sister's name. Toss in some hyacinth, the floral equivalent of, "Oops, my bad." Want to break up gently? Send a yellow carnation. Pretty. Sad. Direct. Entire medieval manuscripts existed solely to explain flower meanings, ornate codices, mapping blooms to emotional subtext like it was horticultural espionage. If you saw someone walk into court with a daisy tucked behind their ear, you knew they were announcing innocence. Spot a thistle by the window? That wasn't gardening. That was, "Stay away, I bite." Flower gifting wasn't random, it was language. It was art. It was strategy. You didn't just grab the nearest bouquet and hope for the best. You curated a botanical mixtape. One scroll even warned, "Let no man confuse the sweet marjoram with wormwood, lest he offend with the scent of sorrow." Translation? Don't screw up your petal playlist, or you'll be explaining your bad choices to a very disappointed dowager. And the response? Just as coded. Accept the bouquet, and you've accepted the message. Wear one of the flowers the next day, and you're signaling mutual affection. Drop a specific bloom in return, you've replied in kind or issued a polite rejection disguised as gardening. It was the romantic equivalent of subtweeting, but with less scandal and more pollen. So there you were, covered in mint, singing beneath her window, holding a bouquet that says, "I adore you, but I also respect your boundaries and your inheritance rights." all while praying she didn't throw her slipper at your face. This was medieval romance, a strange, beautiful, utterly bonkers dance of risk, metaphor, and herbal facial care. A world where a cracked mandolin and a sprig of basil might win a heart. Where love wasn't declared, it was inferred, decoded, and worn like a whisper tucked behind a veil. So if you're sitting there wondering whether to text back with hey or hey, consider your medieval predecessors. They had to memorize flower meanings, learn songs in Latin, and exfoliate with rosemary paste just to tell someone, I like your face. And they didn't even have mouthwash. Still with me? Follow or subscribe the channel, because we're only just scratching the surface, and there's plenty more mint-infused romance to come. You gave her roses. She gave you a weed and a note. I prefer monks. You danced like a dignified goose, flirted with fingertips, and bribed her dad with pigs. Because in medieval romance, the real final boss wasn't love, it was her family and their annual grain yield. Follow or subscribe the channel for more tales of passion, parsley, and poorly timed dancing. We're deep in this absurd, glorious history now. So you've mustered up all your courage. You picked the flowers, checked the moon, rubbed mint on your face, and sent your best poetic bouquet to the lady of your dreams. Surely, your efforts will be rewarded with a smile, a returned ribbon, or at the very least, acknowledgement that you exist. But no, she throws it into a ditch. Or worse, sends a dead weed in response with a note that reads, I prefer monks. Yeah, that one stung. Such was the brutality of medieval floral diplomacy. A returned flower meant interest. A dropped flower? Total annihilation. One poorly chosen petal could end your courtship before it began. And if you were truly unfortunate, the family goat might eat your bouquet before it even made it to her windowsill. Medieval romance was many things fragrant, symbolic, embroidered with peril, but, above all, it was unpredictable. Even public events leaned into the floral theatrics. At tournaments, knights proudly wore bouquets given by ladies, not just for the scent, but as declarations of romantic allegiance. It was like wearing a crush's varsity jacket, except you're swinging a 15-pound mace while doing it. Knights entered the arena covered in blossoms and lace, trying to look both deadly and charming, like a murder-themed wedding cake. But once the flowers were exchanged and the tournament survived, there came another challenge: dancing. Ah yes, the court dance. Less get on the floor and more glide awkwardly in formation while pretending not to be sweating through your doublet. Dancing in the Middle Ages was a form of romantic chess. You had to know the rules, read the signals, and never ever place your hand anywhere scandalous, meaning absolutely no physical contact beyond the fingertips, and even that could start rumors. The dances themselves weren't exactly explosive affairs. Forget the twirls and passionate dips of modern ballroom. This was slow-motion ceremonial procession, performed with all the sensual energy of an apologetic prayer. The bass dance, or low dance, involved elegant gliding steps, synchronized bows, and long moments of mutual eye contact, where both participants silently screamed, "Please don't trip." Still, there was thrill in the tiniest gestures. A shared glance mid-spin could suggest admiration. A barely there fingertip touch was practically a marriage proposal. One poorly timed stumble, however, could doom the entire relationship. If you trod on her foot, you might as well start composing an apology poem and considering the priesthood. Village dances were looser, but only slightly. The carol, a circular dance performed to live music, gave participants a bit more freedom to relax, sing, and express emotion under the watchful gaze of 3-5 chaperones who had nothing better to do than police hand placement and facial expressions. A smile that lingered too long? Scandalous. A missed step into the noblewoman's train? Punishable by public ridicule, or at least a sharply worded complaint from her aunt. The music was live, enthusiastic, and often improvised. Minstrels played whatever was available: bagpipes, flutes, lutes, or sometimes just a man hitting a pot with a spoon. Rhythm was subjective. The dance floor, often a dirt clearing or a poorly swept hall, was treacherous terrain. But people danced anyway. Because where else could you connect with someone while rhythmically stomping and whispering, "Sorry," with your eyes? And here's where it gets truly medieval. Some dating guides actually advised using dance as a compatibility test. If your partner glided smoothly and matched your steps, it meant they were coordinated physically and emotionally. If they spun wildly, flailed dramatically, or elbowed a priest, well, perhaps they weren't quite ready for a long-term commitment, or at least not one that involved dinner parties. So let's say you've danced, you've serenaded, you've jousted in her name, and gifted her enough rosemary to garnish an entire monastery's soup supply. You've earned her affection. Now the real work begins. Because in medieval romance, falling in love was only half the battle. The other half was winning over her family, especially her father, who saw you not as a romantic partner, but as a walking, talking negotiation. This was the true final boss of courtship. Convincing her heart was poetic. Convincing her parents was pure strategy. Were you sufficiently wealthy? Did you own land? Were you excommunicated, and if so, how recently? These were not philosophical questions. These were survival metrics. Families wanted stability, reliability, livestock. Do you have sheep? Excellent. Do you have at least one functioning tooth? Even better. Are you emotionally available? Debatable. But if you had a good harvest and a decent cloak, you might still be in the running. Marriage negotiations weren't candlelit dinners, they were economic treaties disguised as familial conversations. Dowries were discussed with the same intensity as battlefield strategy. A promising suitor might offer a sack of barley, a wool cloak, or a well-carved spoon. A wealthy suitor might offer horses, gold, or an entire pig. If you were truly serious, you brought multiple pigs, maybe a cow, maybe a monk, to explain your intentions in Latin. Symbolic gifts mattered. A bolt of fine linen suggested stability. A painted comb implied thoughtfulness. A jewel said, "I love your daughter, but also, I am so financially stable, I can literally give away rocks." These weren't just gifts, they were power moves. And remember, this entire process often happened while the actual couple was barely allowed to talk. Public conversations were limited, private ones even more so. Romance had to thrive in whispers, glances, and flower petals. Meanwhile, your father argued over how many chickens she was worth. In some cases, the bride had a say. In others, not so much. Even among nobility, romantic agency varied wildly depending on region, religion, and how stubborn the girl's grandmother was. Some women rebelled. Some married secretly. Some waited out poor suitors by mysteriously developing the melancholy lung. Most simply endured the process, hoping the man they danced with wasn't too insufferable without a lute. And if things worked out, if negotiations were successful, property exchanged, and families satisfied, then finally you were allowed to plan the wedding. Or at least, begin the long, chaotic, clergy-approved ordeal that counted as one. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You've still got a dance to rehearse, a pig to bathe, and a carved spoon to polish. Because love in the Middle Ages was never simple. It was staged, symbolic, full of codes, expectations, and the constant looming possibility of being slapped by a rose or rejected via thistle. Still, they made it work. They found beauty in the absurdity. And if they could do all that with chamber pots, bagpipes, and goats, you, dear reader, can probably send that message you've been agonizing over. More tales of pining, pig bartering, and pedal-based rejection coming up. Follow or subscribe the channel so you don't miss the next chapter of this gloriously impractical romance. You passed her father's handshake test, her mother's riddle, and churned butter without flinching. You thought that was hard? Wait until you have to plan your own Viking funeral. Because in love or death, medieval and Norse rituals never went quietly, they sailed out in flames. If you're enjoying this roller coaster of romance, rejection, and rituals, follow or subscribe the channel. We've matched flowers, dueled for affection, and now we're preparing you for the afterlife in style. So you've survived the gauntlet of medieval courtship. You were judged by your handshake, your boots, your land holdings, And whether you could subdue a neighbor in a wrestling match over a fence, you impressed her father without blinking during a 4-hour meal. Her mother made you solve riddles and churn butter, and you did it, stoically, like a man who both fears and loves. You passed. But don't relax yet. We're shifting gears now from weddings to funerals, because in Norse tradition, true legacy wasn't sealed with a ring. It was earned with a sword and a send-off that could light up the coastline. In Viking culture, death was not the end. It was the beginning of a much grander saga, a transition into realms beyond, and how you got there depended entirely on how you exited this one. Dying in your sleep? Weak. Dying while raiding an enemy village with a blade in hand and a prayer to Odin? Now you're talking. The bravest warriors, the ones who died gloriously in battle, were believed to be handpicked by Valkyries, celestial shield maidens, who combed the carnage, looking for candidates worthy of Valhalla. That's Odin's great mead hall in Asgard. There, chosen warriors fought epic battles all day, then feasted, drank, and relived the glory all night. The next day, rinse and repeat. It was eternal frat party meets military boot camp, and you had to earn your invitation. But Valhalla wasn't the only destination. The goddess Freya, equally fierce, often forgotten, claimed half of the fallen warriors for her hall, Folkvanger, a more serene but still battle-hardened paradise. If you didn't die with a weapon in hand or went out from plague, old age, or choking on your beard, you weren't necessarily doomed, but you weren't getting a front-row seat at Ragnarok either. Instead, you'd find yourself in Helheim, a shadowy underworld ruled by the goddess Hel. Yes, that's her name, and yes, she runs it. It wasn't fire and brimstone hell, more like eternal grayscale. Cold, quiet, less screaming, more brooding. A realm for those who died unremarkable deaths, or just didn't check the warrior box on the way out. So yes, dying well mattered, but so did being buried well. The Vikings believed that how you were laid to rest could influence where your soul ended up, and if the living botched your funeral, you might come back. Restless spirits, revenants, and ghostly squatters were a genuine concern. If a Viking funeral wasn't done properly, it wasn't just a spiritual failure, it was a haunting waiting to happen. Which brings us to the most iconic Norse farewell of all, the ship burial. Now, thanks to movies, we tend to imagine Viking funerals as grand spectacles, a flaming longboat drifting into the sea, engulfed in fire as grieving tribesfolk howl into the wind. And honestly, that's not entirely wrong. To the Vikings, the ship was more than transportation. It was a vessel between worlds, both literally and symbolically. A warrior's ship was an extension of himself. It carried him through raids and storms. It held his tools, treasures, and sometimes his goats. So when a chieftain, a warrior, or even a noblewoman passed on, the highest honor was to be buried with their ship, or better yet, in it. In coastal regions like Norway and Sweden, funerals could be epic. The body was prepared, often washed, dressed in fine clothes, and surrounded by grave goods, weapons, jewelry, food, tools, and yes, sometimes animals. Occasionally, and grimly, this included sacrificed slaves or thralls who were believed to accompany their master into the next life. Consent was not always part of the equation. If a full ship burial was chosen, a trench would be dug in the shape of a longboat. Sometimes they used actual vessels. Other times, symbolic arrangements with stones. The deceased was laid inside with all their prized possessions, swords, shields, drinking horns, dried meat, maybe a cherished dog, and then covered in earth to form a burial mound. These weren't just graves. They were monuments, time capsules, status statements for eternity. The most famous examples, like the Oseberg and Gokstad ships, have been unearthed by archaeologists, nearly intact, revealing lives filled with power, wealth, and serious decorative flair. These weren't humble passings. These were Viking mic drops. But what about the fire? Ah yes, the flaming boat funeral. The theatrical, spine-tingling crescendo of Norse send-offs. Not everyone got it, but when they did, it was unforgettable. In island or coastal communities, if the family had enough money, pitch, and permission, they'd place the body on a smaller ship, surround it with grave goods, and push it out to sea. Then with a flaming arrow, torch, or strategically thrown fireball, they'd ignite the vessel. The burning ship wasn't just for drama, it had spiritual function. Fire purified the soul, kept away evil spirits, and ensured no one recycled the boat, one-way ticket to the afterlife. Of course, ships were expensive. You couldn't just go burning boats every weekend. The blazing sea funeral was reserved for the elite. Most people got simpler burials, wrapped in linen, laid in a grave with tools, maybe a chicken, and covered in stones to keep them from walking back out. Still, every Viking, rich or poor, wanted a good death, not just for glory, but for logistics. The afterlife was a bearded bureaucracy, and your manner of death was the stamp on your celestial passport. Go out quietly, and you were headed to Helheim, with the lukewarm soup and soft chairs. Die in battle, and you got to punch Thor in the arm before dinner. So what does all this have to do with medieval romance? Everything. Because in the end, whether you were serenading beneath a window or charging across a battlefield, you were playing your part in a world obsessed with legacy. Love wasn't just about flowers and dances. It was about what you left behind. The songs they sang about you, the stories they whispered, the herbs, the laughter, the screams, the fire. Whether winning a hand in marriage or earning a place in Valhalla, you were proving yourself worthy through effort, honor, and sometimes a flaming boat full of meat. So, if you've ever sent a risky text, sang badly at karaoke, or posted a romantic playlist at 2 a.m., take heart. You're not so different from that Viking with the burning ship or the butter-churning suitor with parsley on his jaw. You're trying. You're risking. You're remembering that the boldest love, like the boldest death, isn't about perfection. It's about passion and fire, and sometimes a goat. If you wanted to get to Valhalla, you didn't just die, you burned. Not with shame or disease, but in a towering inferno of honor, with your best sword and maybe a goat. Because in the Viking world, your funeral wasn't an exit, it was a statement, and ideally, one on fire. Follow or subscribe the channel for more tales where death comes with jewelry, boat insurance, and enough smoke to get Odin's attention. There were many ways to die in the Viking Age, but only a few ways to do it with style. For most Norse warriors, death was not the finish line, it was the audition. You didn't just pass on, you leveled up. And if you wanted a seat at Odin's mead-drenched eternal feast, or even Freya's more refined battlefield lounge, you needed to go out like a legend. Quiet deaths from infection, old age, or misadventures with goats didn't cut it. But a dramatic departure? That was currency. And few departures screamed epic saga, louder than being burned into the afterlife with your favorite sword and a dinner plate of smoked venison. Yes, everyone remembers the ship burials, all fire and waves and symbolic grandeur. But truth be told, most Vikings didn't go sailing into the sunset ablaze on longboats. Ships were expensive, wood was limited, and not every villager had a fjord handy. For most, cremation was the name of the game, and trust the Vikings to turn a pile of logs into a cosmic launchpad. Cremation was more than just disposal. It was transformation. Fire wasn't only fire, it was purification, exaltation, and UPS delivery for the soul. When flames licked at the body, it wasn't about the end. It was the soul's journey home. The smoke spiraled skyward, carrying your spirit to Valhalla, to Folkvanger, to Helheim, or wherever your personal saga was booked to continue. The bigger the fire, the stronger the signal to the gods. No pressure. The pyre itself was an art form, a towering wooden structure, built carefully and loaded with dry timber, pitch, and everything the deceased might need for the next leg of their journey. In the center, the body, dressed in its finest wool or fur or chainmail, depending on your social rank and last-minute laundry. Surrounding them, the greatest hits of their life. For warriors, it was their weapons. For noblewomen, their brooches, beads, and perhaps a key symbolizing household power. But also, I lock things. I lead things. Don't underestimate me. Sometimes pets were added. Dogs, horses, the occasional falcon. These weren't random. They were companions. A warrior wouldn't raid without his axe, so why venture into the afterlife without his steed? Of course, horses didn't volunteer. Ritual sacrifice was part of the deal. Grim? Yes. But to the Norse, it was loyalty, continuing service in the next world, whether animal or human. And yes, occasionally even thralls, slaves, or servants were added to the pyre. Drugged, bound, or willingly sacrificed, they were believed to accompany their master beyond the veil. A brutal reminder. In the Viking world, status clung to you, even in death. And sometimes so did your staff. Before the fire lit, there was ceremony. Days of mourning, feasting, storytelling. The dead weren't sent off in silence. They were celebrated, remembered. Songs were sung by skalds, Viking poets, who knew how to turn even a humble fisherman into a warrior of myth with the right meter and mead. Friends and kin would gather, share stories, tell lies, loving ones, and drink until grief blurred into pride. And then came the fire. A roaring spectacle, a shrine of heat and fury. You needed serious fuel, whole forests, sometimes to reduce a body to ash. The flames rose, the bones cracked, and the smoke curled toward the sky like a message in a language only the gods could read. It was chaos and sanctity. It was the most Viking farewell imaginable. The soul purified, the goods consecrated, the bond between realms torn open for a single, blinding moment. Once the flames died, there was still more to do. The remains, ashes, bone fragments, the half-melted hilt of a sword were gathered with reverence. They might be buried beneath a cairn, stored in an urn carved with runes, or scattered across sacred ground, high hills, quiet forests, or places where old gods once whispered through trees. Sometimes, the site was marked by a runestone, a standing monument that told future generations, this person mattered. This is what they left behind. Because that's what grave goods were about: memory, meaning, continuity. The objects buried or burned with the dead weren't trinkets. They were passports. Each item chosen, placed with intent, whispered a story about the deceased, who they were, what they loved, how they lived, and what they hoped to face beyond. For warriors, this meant swords sometimes bent before burial, to symbolically kill the weapon so it could travel into the afterlife. It also served a less spiritual purpose, discouraging grave robbers. Because even in death, someone was always trying to loot your inventory. Shields, helmets, and even full suits of armor might accompany them, a ghostly loadout for the next realm. The wealthy went even further. Coins, jewelry, drinking horns, imported silks. A Viking chieftain's grave might contain Byzantine glassware and Frankish silver signs, not just of wealth, but of reach. This wasn't just a person, this was a legend, and you'd best treat the ashes with respect. For women, grave goods often reflected their domain, but don't mistake that for lesser value. Intricate brooches, keys, spindles, loops of beads, tools for weaving, cooking, running a household. These weren't just items. They were emblems of order, legacy, and power. Some women were buried with swords of their own, shield maidens, matriarchs, storytellers whose spirits wouldn't wait quietly in hell. Children, too, were given goods, toys, amulets, pets, a tiny horse carved from bone, a miniature axe. It's heartbreaking and tender all at once. Because even in a warrior culture, love endured. Some items were purely symbolic: a broken comb, cleanliness, a fishing hook, survival, a miniature hammer of Thor, protection. The language of the dead was carved in tools and tokens, and each region spoke it slightly differently. In Sweden, you might find full-scale boat graves, rich with goods. In Iceland, where wood was scarce, the dead might be buried with fewer things, but no less meaning. And as Christianity began to spread, some graves began to blend symbols: Thor's hammer beside a cross, pagan ritual beside a hopeful prayer. Death, like life, was a negotiation. A Viking funeral was never just a farewell. It was a final performance, a carefully orchestrated explosion of emotion, belief, smoke, and spirit. The people you left behind weren't just mourning. They were proving something to the gods, to each other, to the land itself, that you mattered, that your story wouldn't end quietly, that you weren't going to the next world empty-handed. So if you ever think modern funerals are intense, remember, once upon a time, people lit boats on fire, sacrificed livestock, sang poetry for 3 days straight, and packed their dead with everything from falcons to falafel equivalents, all to ensure the dearly departed would show up at the gates of the afterlife like, "I'm here, I'm fed, I'm armed, let's do this." Follow or subscribe the channel for part 10. We're halfway through this saga of love, death, flowers, and flaming ships. And things are just heating up. You don't get remembered for dying. You get remembered for the send-off. Flaming ships, sacrificial horses, and a farewell feast that made the gods lean in. Because for the Vikings, death wasn't the end. It was opening night, and the whole village was invited. If you're enjoying this epic of life, love, and postmortem pageantry, follow or subscribe the channel. We've got more sagas to tell, and a few more bodies to burn. If you were lucky enough to be a Viking with status, a story, and a spectacular sword collection, your death wasn't a quiet affair. It was a multi-day production, a blend of solemn ceremony, sacred symbolism, and the kind of theatrical flair only a Norse funeral could deliver. Because when your exit was supposed to launch your soul toward Odin's halls or Freya's fields, you didn't just get a goodbye, you got a saga, preferably with fire, feasting, and at least one animal sacrifice. The ritual began with preparation not just spiritual, but physical. The body of the deceased was washed, dressed in their finest garments, sometimes adorned with a death mask or ceremonial makeup to preserve their appearance. This sacred task usually fell to women in the community, who were seen not only as caretakers of the living but guardians of the threshold between life and death. Some of these women were spiritual figures themselves, Volver, priestesses who wielded ritual authority, carried staves, and could see further than most dared to look. Then came the gathering. Family, friends, warriors, skalds, farmers, neighbors, sometimes entire villages would assemble to honor the dead. In wealthier funerals, guests might travel across fjords and fields, drawn not only by obligation but by the promise of mead, meat, and maybe just a touch of gossip. These ceremonies were equal parts mourning and celebration. It was a wake, yes, but one with high stakes. Think, the solemnity of a memorial crossed with the energy of a reunion, and a hint of competitive drinking. Presiding over it all was the sacrificer. This figure, either a priest or a respected chieftain, conducted the rites and guided the deceased toward the next world. This could include libations, chants, prayers, and yes, blood. Sacrifices were not uncommon. Horses and dogs were the usual offerings, chosen for their symbolic importance. Horses carried the soul, dogs protected it. Both were believed to follow their master into the next world, loyal beyond the grave. And in some rare, elite funerals, particularly for powerful warlords or rulers, the sacrifices got more intense. Human sacrifice. Slaves, concubines, or servants were sometimes intoxicated, strangled, or stabbed, and then laid beside their deceased lord as a final, brutal act of loyalty or domination. It's grim, it's difficult, and it's very, very real. These were not just macabre flourishes. They reflected the Norse belief that life in the afterworld mirrored life in Midgard. If you had attendants in this world, you'd want them in the next. Music and poetry carried the emotional weight. Skalds, the Viking poets, would rise and chant the sagas of the dead, their victories in battle, their voyages across treacherous seas, their acts of generosity, their moments of glory. These weren't eulogies. They were incantations. Each word elevated the deceased, not just for the living, but for the gods. Legacy was currency in the Viking cosmos, and these verses were how you paid your toll. Then came the climax, the burial itself. Whether it was a ship interment, a blazing cremation, or a mound of earth and stone, this moment was the emotional crescendo. Flames would rise or soil would fall. People would shout farewells, weep openly, or stand in silent reverence. Final offerings were often added at the last second: amulets, coins, tokens of affection. One last knife, one last key, one last flower. It was a way to say, take this with you. You'll need it where you're going. And when it was done, they feasted. The funeral feast wasn't just a party. It was sacred. It marked the closing of one chapter and the binding of another. People ate, drank, remembered. They shared stories. They laughed. They wept again. These meals weren't just for comfort. They were acts of spiritual reaffirmation. The bonds of kinship were renewed. Inheritance lines were acknowledged. The social order shaken by death was stitched back together by bread, beer, and memory. This wasn't just about grief. It was about stability. Viking funerals processed loss. Yes, but they also solidified legacy, legitimized heirs, and signaled to the gods, the community, and the world beyond. This person lived, and now they live on. Of course, if there's one element of Viking funerals that still stuns modern minds and stomachs, it's the human sacrifice. Let's be clear, it didn't happen at every funeral. It was rare, but when it did happen, it was unforgettable. Eyewitness accounts like those of the Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan describe the process with chilling clarity. In one case, a slave girl volunteered to die with her master. She was given wine, drugs, and ritual comfort before being ceremonially killed. Her body was placed beside his, both of them sent into the next world together, whether by boat, fire, or mound. To us, it's horrifying. To them, it was destiny. They believed the dead needed companionship, and that those who died beside them would share their honor, or at least their fate, loyalty, fear. Cultural expectation. Whatever the motive, it left a lasting impression. These rituals weren't merely macabre, they were sacred, structured, weighted with purpose. Viking death culture wasn't about closure. It was about continuation, about making sure the story never truly ended. And so they built pyres, carved runestones, painted symbols, sang into the smoke. They held feasts, passed down blades, and buried the dead with so much ceremony it shook the ground. Because to them, every death was the start of something bigger, something worth gathering for, something that deserved to be felt through the pounding of drums, the chanting of names, the roar of fire. So the next time you think about legacy, or loss, or that strange echo that follows grief, remember this. Somewhere, 1,000 years ago, an entire village stood on a windswept hill, watching smoke curl into the sky. Someone poured ale into the dirt, someone tied a ribbon to a sword, and someone, maybe a poet, whispered, "You mattered, and the gods know it now." For more tales of passion, fire, and feasts in the face of death, follow or subscribe the channel, because we're just past halfway, and the saga is far from over. A burning ship, a drugged slave, a poet chanting as the flames rise. She dies to follow her master. He dies with his dogs. And somewhere across the fjord, a burial mound watches. This is not just a funeral. It's a power move, and the land remembers. If you're still aboard this flaming longship of death, legacy, and honor, follow or subscribe the channel. You don't want to miss the next turn history takes. Not all funeral companions went willingly, and some didn't walk. They were carried, offered, or chosen. The most graphic account of such a ritual comes from the 10th century Arab diplomat and observer Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who, while traveling along the Volga River, witnessed a Norse funeral that has haunted history ever since. His words are neither embellished for drama nor softened for sensibility. What he saw was disturbing, but to the Vikings present, it was sacred. He described the death of a chieftain, a man of power and reputation, and with him a slave girl referred to ominously as the Angel of Death. She was selected, or perhaps volunteered, to follow her master into the next world. And it was no peaceful passing. There were days of ceremonial preparation, intoxication, and ritual sex meant to ready her soul. Then, As the mourners chanted and the ship stood waiting, she was strangled and stabbed and placed beside her master on the pyre. It was, to the Norse, a sacred act, a duty, maybe even an honor. To us, it's brutal, it's haunting, it's patriarchal control dressed in ceremonial robes, and yet we can't look away. Because history isn't always comforting, and funerals like these weren't meant to comfort. They were meant to impress gods. Not every sacrifice was human. Far more often, it was animals, horses, dogs, oxen, creatures of power, loyalty, and status. A good horse could carry you into battle in this world and gallop beside you in the next. A dog could guard your hall here and beyond. These offerings served symbolic purposes, yes, but also social ones. A grave with animals said, "This person mattered, enough to lose something more." As Christianity spread northward and local rulers warmed to European alliances, such practices began to fade. By the 11th century, human sacrifice had largely been outlawed across Viking territories. The church found it barbaric, kings found it politically inconvenient, and slowly the pyres grew smaller, the silence got louder. But the echoes remained, because even after the screaming stopped and the fire died out, Viking funerals left behind more than ash. They left behind mounds. The burial mound, or hoger, was the Viking elite's final mic drop. These weren't casual graves. These were monuments. Geographical declarations of, "I was here, and I mattered." Massive, earthen domes, built to be seen from land, sea, and even from enemy villages across the valley. Silent hills with loud legacies. The practice itself predates the Viking Age, but the Norse made it their own, turning these hulking tombs into spiritual lighthouses, territorial claims, and family legacy markers rolled into one. A chieftain's mound could serve multiple functions: a sacred resting place, a gathering point, and a very visible reminder of who owned the land both above and below it. Location mattered. A mound on a hill said, "I ruled here." A mound by the coast said, "I ruled the sea." Some were even built near ancestral sites, tying generations together across centuries of blood, fire, and honor. Occasionally, a new leader would reuse an old mound not out of laziness, but symbolism. To claim the bones of greatness, to inherit the land by sleeping in its history. Inside, the burials were elaborate. The body might lie in a wooden chamber, a stone pit, or even a small boat, surrounded by all the tools of power and survival: shields, weapons, beads, keys, food, sometimes chairs, occasionally a favorite cat. The interior could be layered with textiles, armor, and ornamental objects, a microcosm of their identity, sealed in earth. Then came the dome: earth, sand, stones, sometimes ringed with upright stones arranged like a ship, other times topped with poles or carved staves that may have acted as spirit guides or grave deterrents. You weren't just buried, you were planted, grown into legend. These mounds weren't just sacred, they were political. A Viking leader buried in the right spot could hold power even in death. Communities continued to gather at these sites for oaths, festivals, sacrifices, and remembrance. The dead weren't gone, they were present, watching, anchoring. And today, many of these mounds still remain. Green hills along riverbanks, silent shapes on windswept islands, some excavated, some untouched, all heavy with stories. Archaeologists uncover brooches, swords, bone fragments, and sometimes mysteries. Not all mounds reveal warriors. Some hold priests, artists, children, women. Because Viking funerals, while remembered for their fiery male warriors, often reveal something more profound: a complexity, a balance, especially when you consider the women buried like queens. Take the Oseberg ship burial, one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in Norse history. Inside the wooden ship were not male warriors, but two high-status women, laid to rest in regal splendor: silks, carvings, a full wagon, animal bones, food, ritual tools. Their identities remain a mystery. but scholars believe one may have been a vulva, a seer, priestess, or spiritual leader. A woman of deep ritual power, not just respected, revered. In Viking culture, the vulva held immense spiritual sway. She was the keeper of fate's threads, the speaker of the unseen. When someone died, it was often a woman who washed the body, dressed it, blessed it. The dead passed through her hands on their way to the gods. It was her voice that calmed the grieving, her spells that sanctified the grave. And when she died, she was honored like a queen. Then there were the shield maidens, legendary women warriors, who fought alongside men, who bled and battled and, sometimes, were buried with swords of their own. Their graves, when found, challenge our assumptions. They remind us that Viking valor wasn't bound by gender, it was bound by glory. So, when we talk about Viking funerals, we're not just talking about men on fire with axes in their hands. We're talking about women with staves, with songs, with influence so deep it bent the rituals of death itself. We're talking about a culture where the dead didn't disappear, they echoed. They echo still. In the grassy mounds that rise like quiet waves on Scandinavian hillsides, in the rune stones that whisper names long forgotten, in the poems that survive scratched in bark, inked in sagas, spoken in storm. Because to the Vikings, immortality wasn't about never dying, it was about never being forgotten. So if your name can outlive the fire, you've already won. Follow or subscribe the channel. Part 12 awaits, where myth deepens, memory sharpens, and the Viking spirit proves it's still not done fighting. The flames died, the songs faded, the gods grew quiet. And as Viking ships sank into silence, something else rose, a city of masks, secrets, and reinvention. Because when fire was no longer sacred, people turned to anonymity, and Venice was ready. If you're loving this journey from funerals to festivals, from ship burials to masquerades, follow or subscribe the channel. We're only just beginning to unmask the next chapter of history. By the dawn of the 11th century, the fires of Viking funerals began to dim, not because the Norse lost their taste for drama, but because a new force had arrived. And it didn't swing a sword. It whispered salvation, promised eternity, and carried a book. Christianity swept into Scandinavia not like a tidal wave, but like fog, persistent, creeping, irreversible. With it came new rules, new ideas of heaven, hell, and holiness. Suddenly, fire wasn't purification, it was punishment. The cremation pyres that once lifted souls skyward now marked heresy. Burial was the new command, whole, east-facing, waiting patiently for resurrection. Where once they had sailed to Valhalla, the Norse now faced a different eternity. Sin and salvation replaced bravery and battle. Thor's hammer gave way to the cross. And with it, centuries of ritual fire, sacrifice, chanting, bone began to fade, slowly but surely. Conversion wasn't only spiritual, it was political. Viking kings like Harald Bluetooth of Denmark and Olaf Tryggvason of Norway saw the cross not just as faith, but as diplomacy. Christianity meant alliances with powerful European kingdoms, literacy from monastic scribes, and perhaps most importantly, a means to centralize power and erase tribal division. Outlawing old rites became policy. A funeral was no longer a warrior's right, but a monarch's mandate. The vulva, once revered as seer and spiritual authority, found herself silenced or absorbed into sanitized sainthood. Pagan symbols were dismissed or recast as folk tradition. Burial mounds were looted, leveled, or capped with stone churches. What was once holy was now history. And yet, it never entirely vanished. In rural Iceland and remote fjordside villages, old rites clung stubbornly to life. Ship burials continued in secret. Mound-making lived on, hidden from the eyes of bishops. People hedged their bets, burying their dead with crosses and Thor's hammer, a shield for Christ, a sword for Odin. Why not cover all the bases? Gradually, the traditions didn't die. They blended. Funeral feasts became commemorations. Pagan poems were retold with saintly revisions. And as time marched on, The roaring funeral pyres of the Norse gave way to the quiet, wooden crosses of Christian Scandinavia. The fires went out, but the memory remained. Burial mounds still rise across northern Europe, silent and grassy, marking where legends rest. Names like Odin, Valhalla, and Freya still echo in museums, in fantasy novels, and yes, in whispered bedtime stories told beside fireplaces. And every time a longship blazes across a movie screen, a piece of that ritual fire flares up again. Because some things don't die, they just change shape. And speaking of shape-shifting, let's talk about masks. As the Norse world cooled, another civilization was burning with life. Venice, jewel of the Adriatic, was blossoming into a city of decadence, diplomacy, and disguise. And at its heart, the mask. But the origins of Venetian masks weren't theatrical. They were political. By the 13th century, the Republic of Venice had become a global hub, a crossroads of wealth, spice, silk, and scheming. It was a place where fortunes were made and secrets were currency. Everyone had eyes on everyone else. You were watched, judged, ranked, measured, and people, as they tend to do, longed to escape. Enter the mask. The earliest known law about mask wearing in Venice dates to 1268, and surprise, it wasn't about celebration. It was a ban on gambling, specifically gambling while masked. Because even then, anonymity had its temptations. Disguise offered power, and the state knew it. But masks truly rose to prominence during Carnival, a raucous festival season leading up to Lent. For weeks, the city inverted itself. The pious stepped aside. The powerful loosened their collars. Social roles blurred, vanished, and everyone put on a mask. It wasn't just about hiding. It was about becoming someone else. A noblewoman could slip into a tavern. A servant could mock his master. A priest could walk into places priests weren't supposed to walk. Gender, class, identity all melted beneath plaster and paint. The city didn't just party, it transformed. And at the center of it all was the bauta, the most iconic Venetian mask of all. Unlike the ornate feathers and gilded lace of later centuries, the early bauta was stark, blank, unnerving. A white mask with no mouth opening, worn with a black cloak and a tricorn hat. It erased expression, erased personhood. It wasn't playful, it was powerful. It said, I am no one, and so I can be anyone. This was Venice, at its most subversive, a culture built on rigid hierarchy, using masks to briefly, gloriously tear it all down, but only for a while. Carnival ended. The masks came off. The old rules returned, but the memory of freedom, of laughter, of brief invisibility lingered. And so, from Viking pyres to Venetian masks, we see a pattern. Humans don't let go of rituals. We just rewrite them. We find new ways to mark change from life to death, from identity to anonymity. Fire becomes a sin. Disguise becomes a sanctuary. In one world, you light the sky ablaze to tell the gods you're coming. In another, you vanish behind a mask to whisper, today, I am free. The forms change, but the need to be seen, remembered, transformed, that never goes away. So whether you're building a burial mound, crafting a poem for the dead, or stepping into a masked crowd in a shadowed alley, know this: you're part of a long, strange tradition of humans refusing to disappear quietly. In Venice, truth wore a mask, power wore another, and seduction, that one stayed silent. With blank faces and velvet silence, the people of the Serenissima hid everything: ambition, lust, dissent, even themselves. Because in a city built on secrets, the mask wasn't a disguise. It was the only honest thing they wore. Still with me behind the velvet curtain? Then follow or subscribe the channel. The carnival's not over, and neither is the mystery. The bauta was no mere costume. It was law. It was a uniform. And in Venice, it was the closest thing to equality that ever existed, at least on paper. Behind that stark white face, with its jutting chin and eerie silence, A nobleman became indistinguishable from a merchant. A member of the Council of Ten looked just like the fishmonger he might be spying on. In the alleys, in the palazzos, in the shadowed corners of political assemblies, everyone wore the same face. In theory, this masked democracy was designed to protect the republic. In practice, it created a city where no one could be trusted and anyone could be anyone. During Carnival, masks were a performance. During council meetings, they were protocol. But at all times, they were power. The bauta allowed a man to speak his mind without consequence, to cast a vote without fear, to broker deals, seduce enemies, or disappear into the fog with only a whisper of silk and the glint of a tricorn hat. It was both shield and dagger. It erased identity, and in doing so, gave it an edge sharper than any sword. And yet, for all its menace, the bota was designed for function. You could speak in it, eat in it, drink in it, plot the future of Venice without ever revealing your breath. That's what made it so powerful. It was blank, faceless, formless, and in that neutrality, it became deeply personal. But where the bauta gave men power, the Moretta gave women something more dangerous: control. The Moretta didn't speak. It couldn't. Oval-shaped, smooth and black as velvet midnight, the mask was held in place by a button gripped between the teeth. That's right, no straps, no ribbons, no clasp, just silence. If the woman spoke, the mask fell. If she wanted to be heard, she had to reveal her face. And, in a society that simultaneously feared, fetishized, and obsessively policed female speech, that silence became devastatingly seductive. The Moretta was mystery incarnate. It erased expression, leaving only eyes wide, glinting, unreadable. In a world that judged women on every blink, every smile, every too loud laugh, the Moretta made them unreadable, and therefore untouchable. It wasn't just fashionable, it was strategic. Aristocratic women wore it to mass, to visits, to markets. Behind the Moretta, they could observe, navigate, maneuver, without consequence. No judgment, no gossip, no exposure. Courtesans wore it too, especially those entertaining, powerful clients. In an era when one wrong word could ruin a reputation, the Moretta let them slip through society like velvet ghosts. And that silence? It wasn't submission. It was power. A woman who couldn't speak, couldn't be contradicted, corrected, or condemned. She became untouchable, both alluring and alarming. She was elegance without explanation, mystery without meaning. She could be anyone, and that scared people more than any sword. So yes, in Venice, masks were everywhere. The bauta for men, the Moretta for women, and in their blank faces, the Republic found a strange balance: power through concealment, freedom through artifice, identity through erasure. But Carnival was the grand equalizer, the period when all masks were fair game, and under its glittering chaos, the entire city became a masquerade. The festival, officially sanctioned in 1296, but likely far older, had its roots in Saturnalia, the ancient Roman celebration of reversal. Roles were flipped, rules were blurred. Order was not destroyed, it was playfully, artfully undone. And Venice, ever the theatrical state, embraced it like a masterpiece. For weeks leading up to Lent, the city exploded into spectacle. Music flooded the canals. Jugglers danced in piazzas. Fire breathers lit up alleyways with their own version of rebellion. Noblemen, disguised as beggars, snuck into brothels. Servants in embroidered finery toasted beside senators. The Grand Canal shimmered with gondolas strung with lanterns. Wine flowed like prophecy, and every whispered secret sounded like poetry. Behind every mask was a confession. Behind every gesture, a dare. Carnival wasn't just permitted by the ruling elite. It was strategically allowed. Venice understood the power of illusion. Give the people a space to sin, and they won't rebel. Let them pretend to be free, and they'll accept their chains more gracefully later. Carnival was a pressure valve, beautiful, volatile, and controlled with an expert hand. And the masks were its crown. During this period, laws relaxed to a point. You could wear a mask from December 26th to Shrove Tuesday. But not in churches, not in convents, not while gambling in daylight. Venice knew its citizens too well for that. Still, these laws were bent with all the grace and flexibility the city prided itself on. In Venice, if you weren't breaking at least one rule, were you even alive? For the people, Carnival wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about becoming themselves, free from surveillance, from sin, from the tyranny of identity. The butcher became a poet. The widow became a queen. The pickpocket became a prince, all of them hidden in silk, feathers, velvet, or blank-faced bone. And no mask embodied that paradox, freedom through silence, quite like the Moretta. It stood apart from the opulence. No gold leaf, no gilded smiles, just matte darkness and stillness. A woman in Moretta walked like a shadow through a city of noise. She didn't flirt. She didn't speak. And in doing neither, she said everything. It was erotic. It was terrifying. It was liberating. It was a choice. And in that choice, the choice to not be seen, to not be heard, was a power few men understood. But of course, even the mask couldn't protect everyone forever. Secrets have weight. Masks crack. Carnival ends. Eventually, every whisper becomes an accusation. Every game becomes a trial. And in a city where anonymity was a right and a weapon, it was only a matter of time before someone used the mask to disappear not for pleasure, but for murder. And that is where we're going next. She was draped in black velvet, silent as smoke, watching. He laughed too loudly in the alley, unaware the whisper that would ruin him had already left her lips. In Venice, sin didn't always knock. Sometimes it danced in disguise and kissed your cheek before slipping away. Subscribe or follow, because what happens when a city wears too many masks? Eventually, someone dies behind one. Venice loved its contradictions. It was a republic run by spies, a holy city drunk on perfume, a sanctum of saints who winked during sermons and slipped into shadows by midnight. Carnival was the pressure valve, the sanctioned purge, the church's answer to its own hypocrisy. "Let them sin now," said the priests, "so they may repent later." And repent they did. In hushed confessionals, behind heavy curtains, the city's pulse beat not in rhythm, but in secrecy. At first, the church tolerated it. Carnival served a purpose. It softened the sting of Lent. It gave people a taste of chaos before they returned to piety. But as the masks grew bolder, the silence thicker, and the sins more creative, the Vatican's patience thinned. Masked confessions poured in like incense smoke. "Forgive me, Father. I lay with a stranger I never saw unmasked. Forgive me. I gambled a dowry in a tavern while pretending to be a priest. Forgive me. I wore my lover's husband's mask to meet her in the cloister garden." And the priests? Some blanched. Some recorded names. Others simply put on their own masks after dusk. The city began tightening rules. Edicts forbade masks in daylight, inside convents, or anywhere holy. Certain masks, especially those associated with prostitutes or political satire, were banned altogether. But the mask wearers found loopholes, or bribes, or just darker alleyways. Because once you've tasted freedom, even if it's perfumed and fleeting, you don't go back. One of the most scandalous episodes in Venetian ecclesiastical history, the convent masquerade of 1707. Several nobles, disguised in priestly vestments and feathered domino masks, snuck into a nunnery under the pretext of confession. What followed was not absolution but a masked ball in the cloisters. Lutes played, dances twirled, wine flowed from the communion goblets. It ended in scandal, excommunication, and one very confused goat left tied to the altar. And yet, even after all that, the city didn't stop. Because Venice, for all its saints, was ruled by masks. But masks didn't just protect pleasure, they protected danger. Behind the blank stare of the bauta, anyone could be a lover or a liar, a friend or an assassin. And soon, the carnival, once a stage for laughter and lust, became a breeding ground for secrets and suspicion. By the late 18th century, as the Republic of Venice began to crumble under pressure from Austria and France, The mood shifted. The mask, once playful, now carried a darker promise. Eyes watched from shadows. Secrets changed hands beneath powdered wigs and trembling candlelight. And one mask in particular began to appear in whispered rumors. The Black Domino. Not a stock character, not a noble's disguise, but a myth. A figure in an all-black ensemble cloak, tricorn, mask, who never spoke, never danced, never lifted their cup. They just watched. Some said it was a spurned lover-turned-spy. Others, a political agent gathering secrets for the dying republic. A few whispered it was death itself, walking unnoticed among the living, choosing its next target. What's certain is this: during the final years of Venice's independence, before Napoleon's troops marched in and the Serenissima fell, more than one body was found in the canals after Carnival, still masked, still dressed for a party no one remembered. One woman was discovered floating beneath the Bridge of Sighs, a crimson mask fused to her drowned face. Another, a merchant, was found strangled with his own mask's ribbons locked from behind, the knot too tight for mercy. And in both cases, witnesses swore they had seen a black-cloaked figure slip away seconds before the victims vanished. The mask that once protected fantasy now shielded murder. In the end, it wasn't scandal or satire that ended the masked madness. It was Napoleon. In 1797, Venice fell. The Republic, after 1,000 years of pageantry, paranoia, and poetry, was dissolved. The Doge fled. The Carnival was outlawed. And the masks? They were banned. To the French, the mask was a symbol of decadence, of lies, of old-world corruption. Venice, they said, must modernize, and modern people showed their faces. The velvet silence of the Moretta, the democratic lie of the Bauta, the comic truths of Harlequin, all swept away by soldiers and civil codes. For nearly 2 centuries, the masks disappeared. Carnival vanished. The palazzos fell quiet. The Grand Canal, once filled with music and mystery, echoed only with commerce and memory. But like everything in Venice, nothing really stays gone. In 1979, after years of cultural revival, the Carnival of Venice was reborn. Tourists returned. Masks reappeared, now sold in shops, worn by travelers, painted in gold and feathers. The old characters returned too. Harlequin danced again. Pantalone grumbled. Even the Moretta, once silenced, found new admirers. But something had changed. The real Carnival, the dangerous one, the one where masks whispered sins, concealed plots, and flirted with assassination, that one remained in the shadows. Now, when you see a mask in Venice, remember, it's not just art, it's history. A lie that once told the truth. A face that once got away with murder. So, yes, the masks are back. But if you ever find yourself walking alone on a foggy Venetian night and a black figure in a bauta stops to watch you, don't wave. And whatever you do, sin wore silk and a smile. Truth danced in shadows. And power? It hid behind a mask. For centuries, Venice thrived on duality, a devout Catholic soul wrapped in a velvet robe of vice. Behind every blessing was a bargain, and behind every bishop's cross, a masquerade invitation. Yes, you heard that right. Even the clergy partied. Bishops hosted masked balls that would have made the devil blush. High-ranking officials looked the other way, especially if the view included gold, influence, or an indecent proposal whispered from behind a gilded columbina. Yet, even in this well-oiled machinery of indulgence, panic would sometimes break through the perfume and parades. Plagues descended like curses, and with them came bans. Authorities, gripped by fear, and perhaps guilt, declared masks illegal. They feared disease would fester behind anonymity, that people would gather, laugh, love, and spread something more deadly than secrets. But much like sin in Venice, those bans never stuck. The masks always returned, slipping back into society like old lovers through a familiar window. By the 18th century, the world was changing. Enlightenment thinkers began asking uncomfortable questions about power, about God, and yes, even about Carnival. Venice, still clinging to its religious roots, began to lose its grip. The carnival, once cloaked in sacred rhythms, became a naked display of decadence. The sermons kept coming, but no one was listening. The church wagged its finger, then its fist, but it could never quite peel the mask off Venice's face. The city remained a paradox, half in prayer, half in pleasure, entirely in costume. But no empire, no matter how divine or debauched, can dance forever. And in 1797, the music stopped. Napoleon Bonaparte, little man with big plans, marched into the most serene republic and shattered a millennium of masked serenity. Venice fell, not with a bang, but with bootsteps on marble and the cold efficiency of French occupation. The symbols of a once glorious republic were dismantled like theater props. And one of the first casualties? Carnival. To the French, it wasn't a festival. It was a threat. Masks weren't costumes, they were rebellion stitched in velvet and sarcasm. Venice, already known for its political intrigue, was now under foreign scrutiny, what Venetians called pageantry, the occupiers called peril. And so, the decree came down. No more carnival. No more masks, except, of course, for the ones worn in official state theaters, because even tyrants enjoy a bit of tragedy. And just like that, the masquerade ended. Where there had once been laughter echoing down candlelit alleyways, now there was silence. The kind of silence that only boots and bureaucracy could enforce. The Guild of the Maschereri proud mask makers, who once held court in their workshops, vanished into obscurity. Some pivoted to making props for stage plays. Others closed their doors forever. And the ones who stayed? They crafted in whispers. It was never just about masks. It was about identity, freedom, and the wild joy of becoming someone else for a night. Without them, Venice felt stripped bare. All of its mystery, all its dangerous glamour, drained away like wine from a shattered goblet. The 19th century brought more rulers, but fewer balls. The Austrians came, then the Italians. Each added new restrictions, new rules, more gray to the once technicolor dream. Carnival became a ghost, haunting dusty ballrooms and whispered memories. Some celebrated in secret behind locked doors, in backroom salons. Others clung to the past on stages, where illusion was still allowed, as long as it came with a script. The streets, once alive with poetry and flirtation, grew still. Gondolas drifted quieter, lanterns dimmed, and the masks, they slept. But masks, like stories, never die. They wait. And Venice, dear, decadent, dramatic Venice cannot resist a good comeback. In 1979, after nearly 2 centuries in exile, the Carnival of Venice was reborn, not through rebellion, but revival. The city, scarred yet still seductive, reawakened her old lover, the mask. But this time, things were different. This wasn't about seduction in alleys or clandestine duels. This was art, heritage, and yes, tourism. The new carnival came not from the people but from planners. Funded by cultural committees, powered by camera lenses, and fueled by a desire to remind the world, Venice still knew how to put on a show. And what a show it was. The fog rolled in like curtains, and through it glided masked figures in billowing 18th century gowns, powdered wigs, and faces frozen in opulent silence. The Grand Canal shimmered with reflections of lanterns and fireworks. Piazza San Marco became a stage once more, not for revolt or seduction, but for acrobats, musicians, and curated nostalgia. Artisans resurrected the ancient craft. The Maschereri returned, forging masks in papier-mâché, leather, ceramic, and glass. Their work now less camouflage, more masterpiece. Their creations, once functional, now flamboyant, jeweled brows, gilded lips, feathers like fire. The Volto reappeared, the classic full-face mask, now a canvas for gold leaf and peacock patterns. The Colombina danced again, delicate, feathered, flirtatious. Fantastical masks emerged too: dragons, demons, gods conjuring mythology and madness in equal measure. Even the old Commedia dell'arte characters Harlequin, Pantalone, Il Dottore returned. But not for satire, for selfies. Carnival had changed. It was no longer a ritual. It was a reenactment. Where once masks were worn to blur class, now they came with a price tag. Costumes were rented, events ticketed. The old secretive thrill of slipping into silk and becoming someone else had been replaced by curated photo ops and social media filters. Carnival had become safe, structured a memory fenced in by velvet ropes. And yet, something magical lingered. For a few fleeting weeks each year, Venice remembered how to transform, remembered how to seduce, remembered how to lose itself behind a mask and dance through fog, candlelight, and legend. Because while history might be rewritten, and revolutions forgotten, and empires replaced by hotels, the mask endures. And so does the spirit of the city that invented it. So, if you ever walk through Venice in February, listen carefully. Behind the laughter, the costumes, the overpriced espresso, there's a whisper in the wind, a secret longing, a quiet invitation. Dare to become someone else, even for a night. If you hear it, follow it. And if you dare to see what lies beyond the mask, follow or subscribe the channel. Because in part 15, we're not in Venice anymore. But the lies? Oh, they're coming with us. Venice had whispered through silk and laughter, now Kyoto screamed in steel and blood. Where one city masked desire, another sharpened it into a blade. And beneath the cherry blossoms of Japan, the wind carried secrets of revolution. The old spell of Venice, still wrapped in its embroidered elegance and ghostly allure, didn't vanish, it simply adjusted its mask. The carnival that once dared to shake empires returned not as a phoenix, but as a chameleon, surviving by evolving. Though the masks gleamed brighter, and the streets swelled with cameras instead of conspiracies, the ancient pulse still beat quietly beneath the glitter. Why did the Venetians cling so fiercely to the ritual of concealment? Why did a people obsessed with social performance fall madly, almost spiritually, in love with anonymity? The answer lies not in the feathered flourishes of a Colombina or the eerie blankness of a Bauta, but in the very fabric of the human soul. At its heart, the Venetian mask wasn't a disguise, it was a key to freedom, a key to rebellion, a key to becoming more than the role stitched to your birth. In a world chiseled rigid by class, gender, and decorum, the mask didn't cover who you wear, it unlocked who you could be. A merchant could transform into a Casanova. A noblewoman might taste the forbidden thrill of sin. A servant could confront his master. A man could become a goddess. And a woman? She could become myth. These masks were never just parchment and paint. They were instruments of psychological alchemy. With them, people explored shadows they'd never dared touch in daylight. They crossed social chasms, danced with temptation, and defied their own destinies. Actor and audience merged. Reality and performance dissolved. And in Venice, a city built quite literally on reflection, this mirrored magic made perfect sense. Even today, the mask remains our spiritual heirloom. In carnivals, cosplay, masquerade balls, and Halloween nights, we feel the ancient current. When we don a mask, something stirs. We feel braver, flirtier, bolder. We say things we wouldn't dare otherwise. There's a strange, luminous honesty in disguise, the kind that tells truth not by showing, but by hiding. And that's the paradox of the Venetian mask. It was always both sanctuary and snare. It stood at the intersection of democracy and decadence, rebellion and reverence. It allowed the weak to mock the mighty, and the mighty to sin without consequence. It was both shield and sword. It was empowerment, and it was escape. In today's surveillance-soaked, face-scanned, algorithm-fed world, perhaps what we've lost is not just privacy, but possibility. The right to mystery. The freedom to reinvent without explaining ourselves. In Venice, they didn't wear masks to hide who they were. They wore them to explore who they might be. So the next time you see a Venetian mask, glinting with gold and shadow, feathers fluttering against time itself, don't dismiss it as a tourist trinket. It's not a costume. It's a relic of resistance. a key to a city of dreams and disguises, a shimmering doorway to the theater of desire, rebellion, and reinvention. And now, let's journey across continents, eastward, to a very different masquerade. From masked balls to bloody streets, the unmasking of Kyoto. By the early 1860s, Kyoto had transformed into something unrecognizable. It wasn't the quiet city of calligraphy, and calm the world imagine it was a stage soaked in tension, a battlefield wrapped in temple silk. Assassins crept like shadows, corpses floated in rivers, and the alleyways whispered like gossips on the brink of hysteria. Japan, after centuries of enforced stillness under the Tokugawa shogunate, was cracking in half. The world had knocked, then stormed, its gates first with polite emissaries, then with ironclad warships. America, Britain, France, the barbarians had arrived, and they weren't leaving. This wasn't just political, it was spiritual, and the rallying cry emerged like thunder. Sano joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. But these weren't words written on banners. These were mantras painted in blood. Radical samurai from powerful domains like Choshu and Satsuma surged into Kyoto like stormwater. To them, the city was more than a capital. It was the beating heart of a forgotten empire, a sacred stage on which Japan's soul would either rise or be buried. Their mission? Dismantle the shogunate's crumbling grip, one sword stroke at a time. Meanwhile, in Edo modern-day Tokyo, the shogun's advisors watched the empire slip through their fingers. They still ruled on paper, but in Kyoto, they were ghosts mocked by courtiers and hunted by knives. In a desperate countermove, the shogunate dispatched a strange band of warriors to Kyoto, masterless, rootless, dangerous. They were called the Roshigumiya Freelance Militia of Ronin, sent to act as an escort for the shogun's imperial visit in 1863. But as is often the case in Japanese history, what began as loyalty splintered into legend. Because when the mission ended, a faction refused to return to Edo. They stayed, quietly, watching, waiting, what they would become. What they would forge was not just a force, but a myth. They would call themselves something new, something unforgettable. The Shinsengumi. They came in shadows, but they didn't hide. Clad in sky-blue jackets, they patrolled Kyoto with swords and silencemen, with no past, no fear, and no mercy. The Shinsengumi had arrived, and Kyoto would never breathe the same way again. Out of 13 wandering blades, 13 masterless men caught in the limbo between loyalty and lawlessness, a decision was made that would slice through Japanese history. While the rest of the Roshigumi returned to Edo, 13 stayed behind. Not out of stubbornness, not even for glory. They stayed because they felt something deeper. Kyoto wasn't just a destination. It was a calling, a battlefield waiting for warriors, a flame begging to be controlled before it consumed the empire. These men, drawn together not by class or command, but by conviction, would become the living edge of the dying Tokugawa sword. Backed by the powerful Aizu Domaina, stalwart ally of the shogunate, they were ordered to police Kyoto, to root out the rot of rebellion. They didn't wear armor, they wore defiance. They weren't heirs to ancient samurai houses. They were misfits, outcasts, failed farmers, disgraced ronin. And yet, they wielded a terrifying purity, absolute loyalty to the shogunate, and a willingness to kill for it. Kyoto, once the peaceful city of cloistered emperors and quiet gardens, transformed into a war zone of whispers. The enemy wasn't foreign, it was internal. Rebels, radicals, and Roninal, armed with ideas as sharp as blades lurking behind the elegance of tradition. From this smoke, a new symbol rose. Dressed in blue Heiori jackets, swords at their hips, death in their eyes, the Shinsengumi, not an army, not a police force. Something else, a cult of swordsmen, shaped by fear, discipline, and a savage sense of honor. At first, they were a rumor, a handful of men enforcing order with clenched fists and slashed throats, but it didn't take long for that rumor to bloom into dread. Within a few years, the Shinsengumi became one of the most feared and ruthless forces in all of Kyoto. Where they walked, blood followed. Where they paused, silence. Where they stayed, people disappeared. Their rise to power wasn't just strategy, it was also sheer personality. 3 men forged the heart of this storm: Serizawa Kamo, Kondo Isami, and Hijikata Toshizo. They didn't belong to noble bloodlines. They didn't inherit status. They seized it. Serizawa was fire chaotic, intoxicating, and just as capable of burning his friends as his enemies. He drank like a demon, brawled like a beast, extorted the very citizens he was sworn to protect, and treated Kyoto like his personal playground of terror. While his violence may have brought short-term respect through fear, it also threatened to collapse the fragile credibility of the group. Kondo was the opposite, a quiet, calculating martial arts instructor forged in the discipline of the Tenin Rishin Ryu school. Next to him stood Hijikata, demon vice commander, cold, precise, and utterly unwavering. Together they understood something Serizawa did not: the sword is meaningless without order. So, in the fall of 1863, they made their move. It was quick, it was bloody, it was final. In a thunderous night raid, Serizawa and his loyalists were slaughtered by their own, not rebels, not enemies, brothers with blades. It was a purge dressed as purification. And it became a warning burned into the bones of the Shinsengumi: loyalty above all disobedience earns death. With Serizawa gone, Kondo took official command. Hijikata became his iron shadow. And the Shinsengumi turned from a squad of ronin into a machine steel-souled, code-bound, and bound by fearsome rules. They issued a code of conduct that would have made ancient samurai flinch. Disobey an order? Die. Try to leave? Die. Duel without permission? Die. The price of brotherhood was blood, and every recruit paid in advance with their life. Their uniform light blue haori jackets with white mountain-like stripes was more than a costume. It was a psychological weapon, a moving death sentence. When those cloaks appeared in the misty alleyways of Kyoto, people trembled. Criminals fled. Rebels froze. Even innocent citizens averted their eyes. The wolves were out. But the Shinsengumi weren't just enforcers. They were idealists, with blades, true believers in a vanishing world. While the rest of Japan was trading swords for rifles, tradition for diplomacy, and codes for convenience, the Shinsengumi doubled down. They clung to Bushido like it was a lifeline. Honor, loyalty. The blade as gospel, no compromise, no apology. In their minds, they weren't thugs in blue. They were the last guardians of a pure Japan, a Japan before foreigners, before steamships, before politics. They weren't trying to modernize the world. They were trying to purify it. And so, their patrols were more than law enforcement. They were rituals of order. Assassins were chased down and killed in the streets. Conspirators dragged from their homes. Interrogations were swift and often final. The Shinsengumi weren't afraid of blood, they were baptized in it. And then came the moment that immortalized them. One humid summer night in July of 1864, a whisper reached Shinsengumi ears. A group of pro-imperial radicals firebrands from Choshu and other rebellious domain shad gathered at the Ikadaya Inn, plotting to set Kyoto ablaze and assassinate key shogunate officials. The city was about to be thrown into chaos. The Shinsengumi didn't hesitate. Swords drawn, cloaks flying, no backup, no second thought. They stormed the inn like thunder wrapped in silk. Rooms erupted in screams and steel. In a flurry of blades, the Shinsengumi annihilated the rebel cell, slashing through the plot before the city even smelled smoke. It wasn't just a win. It was a spectacle. The Ikadaya incident turned them into legends. Overnight, their name became myth. To their allies, they were heroes. To their enemies, demons in human form. To the people of Kyoto, they were unavoidable. But myth comes with a price, and the Shinsengumi would soon learn that even swords rust under the weight of time. A single lantern flickered and then the blades began to sink. 10 men entered a hornet's nest of swords and revolution and left it drenched in blood and glory. This was no skirmish. This was the moment the Shinsengumi became immortal. Kyoto slept, or at least it tried to, in the alleys of the ancient capital, under paper lanterns swaying like uneasy spirits. Something stirred silent, sharp, and deadly. It was 1864, and the summer heat clung to the wooden walls of the Ikudaya Inn like a warning. Inside, revolution brewed over whispered plans and flickering oil lamps. The plot? Set Kyoto ablaze. Assassinate high-ranking shogunate officials. Kidnap the levers of power. Create chaos so devastating, the nation would have no choice but to rally around the emperor. The conspirators weren't amateurs. They were hardened pro-imperial samurai from Choshu and allied clans, determined to end the Tokugawa regime in a single infernal act. But outside, on the lantern-lit streets, another kind of fire approached. It wore light blue and carried steel, not torches. The Shinsengumi had arrived. Kondo Isami led them. 10 men. That's all. 10 blades against dozens of trained rebels. Reinforcements under Hijikata Toshizo would follow, but this opening move was a gamble soaked in steel. 10 men walked into the Ikudaya Inn. Most of them weren't noble-born, but they were determined to carve their names into Kyoto's bones. What happened next wasn't a battle. It was a detonation. The front door shattered. Swords flashed. The walls of the inn paper-thin and centuries-old splintered under the chaos. Screams tangled with steel. Tatami mats tore like parchment soaked in blood. For 2 hours, blades clashed in the tight, airless rooms of the inn. Revolutionaries fought back with fury, but the Shinsengumi had the advantage of surprise and a terrifying conviction. They didn't fight for survival, they fought for a cause, a code, a shogunate sliding into twilight. By the end, 7 rebels lay dead. Others, bloodied and stunned, were dragged away into the Kyoto night. The Shinsengumi had lost only 1 man. A steep price, yes, but the reward was enormous. The plot to raise Kyoto had been destroyed, and the myth of the Shinsengumi had exploded into national consciousness. For the Tokugawa shogunate, the Ikudaya incident was a miracle. The wolves in blue had prevented what might have been the symbolic death of their regime. Newspapers praised them. Officials honored them. Citizens, terrified and awestruck, began to whisper their name with both fear and admiration. Even their critics, those who once dismissed them as thugs with swords, had to admit the Shinsengumi got the job done. But not everyone saw heroes. To the imperial loyalists, the men in blue weren't guardians. They were monsters, executioners with legal permission, assassins dressed as police, enforcers of a dying government's cruel last gasp. And as their reputation grew, so did their enemies. Every new kill bought them fame, but also made them targets. For Kondo and Hijikata, though, the Ikudaya wasn't just a victory. It was validation, proof that their ruthless philosophy worked. That loyalty, discipline, and unflinching violence could still hold the line against chaos. From that point on, they never looked back. The swords would stay drawn permanently. But their rise wasn't built on blood alone. It was also built on something far more terrifying: routine. The Shinsengumi's true strength wasn't in their sword set, was in their system. Daily training at Kondo's Tenon Rishin Ryu school hardened them into street fighters, not duelists. This wasn't the elegant, dance-like combat of the aristocratic dojo. This was dirty, tight quarters killing meant for alleys, doorways, and shadowy corners. The real Kyoto, they didn't just swing swords. They listened, they watched, and they spied. Intelligence was their second blade. The Shinsengumi built a web of informants that stretched across the city. Monks, beggars, merchants, anyone could be their eyes. Whispers in temples, notes hidden in tea shops, conversations overheard beneath sakura trees. By the time they knocked on a door, they already knew what lay behind it. And when they did knock, it was too late. Kyoto began to fear the sound of footsteps, a midnight knock, a crash, a flash of blue in the candlelight. Men dragged from their beds, wives screaming, neighbors silent. The Shinsengumi didn't just eliminate threats, they erased them. Even inside their own ranks, fear ruled. Hijikata enforced the code with the same severity he used on rebels. Disobedience? Seppuku. Private duels? Seppuku. Cowardice? Seppuku. His nickname wasn't a jokei, was the demon vice commander, and he demanded not just loyalty, but total transformation. To be Shinsengumi wasn't a jobit, was a new identity. You became the group. You bled for the group. You vanished as an individual. You were either with them or in their way. Their numbers swelled. From the original 13, they became nearly 200. But growth comes with danger. Not everyone who joined believed in the code. Some were spies. Others crumbled under the pressure. Still more were quietly purged. Suspicion became routine, paranoia policy. And yet, they endured, because even through the fractures, they held fast to one unshakable belief. The samurai world was worth saving. They weren't mercenaries chasing silver. They were ideologues, dreaming of a Japan where honor ruled and the sword was law, where loyalty didn't bend to politics, where a warrior's soul still mattered. But Ideal 7, the sharpest, one-skin shatter. Outside Kyoto, the world was changing faster than any katana could slice. The Tokugawa regime was cracking. Foreign pressure, internal corruption, economic unrest. It all spiraled into a slow collapse. What once had been a sacred question, who do you serve, became a darker one. Will you survive? Across the nation, rival domains like Choshu and Satsuma did something unthinkable. They allied. Former enemies, now united under the imperial banner, modernizing their armies with Western rifles and strategies. While the Shinsengumi doubled down on tradition, their enemies embraced change. And change had firepower. The Shinsengumi were still hunting rebels in alleys, but their enemies were now forming battalions. It was no longer a matter of rebellion versus order. It was a clash between centuries. On one side, swords, codes, and creeds. On the other, rifles, steam, and revolution. And the Shinsengumi? They stood in the middle, the last defenders of a crumbling dream. Swords drawn, knowing full well the tide was rising. The age of the bullet was here, and the sword no longer scared anyone. What was once justice now looked like vengeance in a new Japan that no longer needed wolves. But the Shinsengumi would rather die as ghosts of the past than live in a future that forgot them. By the end of 1867, Kyoto had become a city with no room for nostalgia. Rifles clicked in alleyways where katanas once reigned. The Shinsengumi, once hailed as the fierce sentinels of a trembling shogunate, now found themselves glaring into the muzzle of a new Aegeon, where discipline and loyalty were no match for gunpowder and foreign training manuals. Across Japan, the winds had shifted. Modernization arrived not as a whisper but as a cannon blast. The domains of Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa weren't just embracing Western weapons, they were mastering them. Rifles replaced swords. Boots replaced sandals. Foreign officers drilled young soldiers not in the way of the blade, but in the science of war. And in this evolving theater, the Shinsengumi looked increasingly like actors from a forgotten play, still rehearsing Bushido lines in a world that had moved on to revolvers and regiments. Within Kyoto, public perception had turned icy. The blue jackets that once drew quiet awe now drew shudders. The citizens, who had once relied on the Shinsengumi to bring order, began to see only cruelty. Their raids no longer felt righteous, they felt panicked. Their interrogations, once surgical, now reeked of desperation. Whispers spread. The wolves were cornered. And everyone knows a cornered wolf doesn't guard it bites. Then came the final blow. In a move that shocked both allies and enemies, Tokugawa Yoshinobute's last shogun resigned. He stepped down, ostensibly handing authority back to the emperor. To the public, it looked like peace, a graceful bow to inevitable change. But to those who knew politics, it was a ploy, a desperate attempt to retain power behind a curtain of imperial grace. The new emperor's loyalists saw through it immediately. Power shifted decisively to the imperial court, and Kyoto itself became enemy territory for the Tokugawa loyalists. But the Shinsengumi didn't retreat. Not in spirit, not in principle, not even when the ground beneath them burned with betrayal. To them, Yoshinobu's resignation wasn't a surrender, it was treason. They refused to vanish quietly. With Kyoto lost, the Shinsengumi regrouped in Fushimi, a quiet village south of the city. There, under gray skies and the smell of gunpowder, they sharpened their swords, polished their fading armor, and prepared for war. Their rifles, few and outdated, were a sad contrast to the gleaming modern arsenals of their enemies. But their resolve had never been more clear. If this was to be their last stand, then it would be in blue Haori, katana in hand, dying for the order they had sworn to protect. And so began the Boshin Morte last stand of feudal Japan. On one side, the Tokugawa loyalists clinging to honor. On the other, the modernized imperial forces carrying the banners of a new empire. For the Shinsengumi, it was never just a war, it was a line in the sand. A line that screamed, "We remember who we are." January 1868. The skies over Kyoto spat snow as the two sides met at Toba Fushimi. This was no alleyway skirmish. This was war in full regalia. Cannons roared across rice fields. Rifle volleys turned frost to fog. And in the middle of it all, marching under the blue Haori of an era already dead, stood the Shinsengumi. They looked like ghosts, romantic, disciplined, and heartbreakingly outmatched. Their swords were sharp, but their enemy was sharper, not in steel but in science. The imperial army moved like clockwork, trained in Western formations, armed with weapons that turned human bodies into red mist from dozens of yards away. Kondo Isami, once the fearless tactician of the Ikadaya raid, now struggled under the weight of years and wounds. Beside him, Hijikata Toshizo remained unshaken, an iron soul burning with cold fire. They commanded what was essentially a relic battalion, men forged for a world that no longer existed, but they charged anyway. They slashed through riflemen in close quarters. They died with dignity and courage. But no matter how fiercely they fought, the golden banner of the emperor loomed larger. Many Tokugawa troops, seeing the sacred symbol of the imperial court, hesitated to strike. Some refused to fight altogether. Others surrendered without lifting their swords. The Shinsengumi did neither. They held the line until it broke. Then they retreated, bloodied and limping, into the smoke of a battlefield that had become their tombstone. It wasn't just a loss, it was a requiem. The snow had been white. By nightfall, it was red. The defeat at Toba Fushimi signaled the official end of Tokugawa rule. The emperor's forces declared anyone still loyal to the shogunate an enemy of the throne. Overnight, the Shinsengumi went from protectors of Kyoto to fugitives. Their blue coats became targets, their swords became liabilities, and their names appeared on kill lists. But they still didn't disband. Retreating south, they regrouped under Hijikata, who now carried both blade and burden. Kondo, wounded and aging, tried to keep command, but the truth was clear: his time was ending. They reorganized as the Koyo Chimbutai, a last-ditch force to stabilize the crumbling east. But what they were really chasing was a ghost of vision of Japan that no longer had a place to stand. Province to province, they moved like wraiths, always one step behind the imperial forces. Many Tokugawa supporters surrendered or switched sides, but not the Shinsengumi. They refused to modernize, refused to compromise. They weren't fighting for victory anymore, they were fighting for remembrance, for the right to be a footnote carved in honor, not forgotten ink in a history book. In April 1868, Kondo attempted to regroup with allies near Edo. He was captured. He gave a false name. It didn't work. His identity was exposed. The punishment came swiftly. Execution by beheading. His head was sent to Kyoto and displayed in public, a final insult to a man who had once ruled its streets. Hijikata did not break. He did not pause. He pressed northward. The remnants of the Shinsengumi, joined the last desperate resistance, the Republic of Izo, established in far-off Hokkaido, a frozen wilderness that now held the final heartbeat of a vanished empire. It was cold. It was bleak. It was beautiful. And it was still Japan. That was enough for them to fight. Enomoto Takeaki, a naval officer who had refused to surrender the shogunate's fleet, led this last bastion. Hijikata, the demon vice commander, became a general. No longer a back-alley enforcer now, a war leader of a republic already destined to fail. They were outnumbered, outgunned, surrounded, but they stood tall. Because for Hijikata, this was no longer about winning. It was about finishing the oath. To die, not as a rebel but as a samurai. To those still listening, still breathing, still bleeding for the old ways, he gave one final command. Fight until the snow swallows us. When the bullet struck Hijikata, it didn't just pierce a man, it ended an era. The last true samurai didn't surrender to history. He stared it in the eye and fell with his sword drawn. In the snows of Hakodate, Japan buried a man, awakened a legend. By the time the smoke settled over the battered plains of Hakodate, there was almost nothing left to defend. What once had been the disciplined, steel-hard core of the Shinsengumi was now a flickering ember, fewer than 100 men, broken in body, but unbroken in resolve. These were not warriors clinging to delusions of victory. They knew, everyone knew, this was the end, not just of the battle, not just of the Republic of Izo, but of everything they had lived, bled, and killed for. Hijikata Toshizo, ever the demon vice commander, stood at the edge of that final storm. His haori was tattered, his eyes hollowed by grief and frost, but his grip on the sword was still iron. He no longer chased survival, he chased meaning. He didn't want to die, he wanted to matter. He led from the front as he always had. While others faltered, he rode into the cold wind with sword drawn, commanding the final line of defense with the precision of a man who had spent his life preparing for this moment. If death was coming, and it was, then it would find him standing. The Imperial Army, swollen with victory and Western firepower, unleashed a full assault on Hokkaido. One stronghold after another fell to the thud of cannon fire and the mechanical rhythm of rifles. There was no room for swords, here only shadows, bayonets, and the deafening silence of history being rewritten. The Shinsengumi's last stand came at Hakodate, a port city cloaked in sea mist and desperation. It was here, on June 20, 1869, amid a skirmish near the fort of Benton, that fate finally found Hijikata. A single bullet tore through the lower back of the man who had once shattered rebel lines with just his stare. There were no heroic charges this time, no elegant duel, just the jarring percussion of a gunshot that ended a legend. He was 34 years old, and with his fall, the age of the samurai fell with him. No one knows for certain what became of his body. Some say his comrades, driven by love and fear of desecration, buried him in secret. Others claim he was cremated, reduced to ashes that drifted across the cold northern sea. But what remains undeniable is the letter he wrote shortly before the final battle, calm, proud, and void of bitterness. In it, he asked for nothing except to be remembered. And remembered he was. With Hijikata's death, the Shinsengumi ceased to exist in the flesh, but in spirit, that's when they truly began. Days after Hakodate fell, the Republic of Izo surrendered. The Tokugawa loyalists were officially crushed. The Meiji government had won. The old Japan, with its codes and creeds, vanished like mist under cannon fire. Feudalism collapsed. The emperor reigned. The samurai were outlawed. And yet, in the silence that followed, something stirred. In the years that followed the war, Japan transformed at breakneck speed. It traded swords for steamships, castles for railways, scrolls for typewriters. A new army was born, a new constitution written. And the past, it seemed, was left behind. But not all of it. Not entirely. The story of the Shinsengumi refused to die. Though crushed militarily, They rose in the imagination of a country still unsure of its modern soul. The tragic loyalty of Kondo Isami, the burning precision of Hijikata Toshizo, the ethereal brilliance of Okita Soja, stricken with tuberculosis, yet undefeated in spirit. They were no longer fugitives. They became archetypes etched into books, carved into plays, painted onto scrolls, and later flickering across movie screens and manga panels. Writers transformed them into tragic heroes, not relics but martyrs, men who knew they could not win and chose to fight anyway. Samurai who clung to principle not because it was convenient, but because it was all they had left. Their code, once rigid and feared, began to shimmer with poetic defiance. Bushido was no longer the law of the land, but it became the heartbeat of nostalgia. Where modernity brought prosperity, the Shinsengumi brought meaning. Today, you can still find their memory carved into the bones of Japan. In Kyoto, visitors line up outside the Mibu Temple, where their headquarters once stood. In Tokyo, museums showcase their weapons, uniforms, and haunting portraits. Their distinctive pale blue jackets have become cultural icons, emblems of loyalty in an age obsessed with reinvention. They appear everywhere, in films and anime, fighting spectral battles against the tide of time. In manga, they're reborn as warriors, rebels, even supernatural guardians. In cosplay, they stride through conventions, katana at their hips, their stories told in every detail of fabric and steel. Hijikata, in particular, has become a symbol of unbreakable will. Cold, strategic, relentless, and deeply human beneath the armor. But beyond the visuals and dramatizations, something deeper survives. The Shinsengumi represent the eternal conflict between progress and identity. They were men caught in the gears of a world shifting faster than they could swing their swords, and instead of adapting, they stood still. Not out of ignorance, but out of principle. That defiance, beautiful, painful, and absolute, is what keeps them alive in the hearts of those who understand that not all battles are meant to be won. Sometimes, standing your ground is the victory. They remind us that even as technology advances, as cultures evolve, and as empires rise and fall, the human soul still aches for meaning, for honor, for purpose, and for stories that prove we are more than survival. We are what we stand for. And so, the Shinsengumi live on, not in barracks, not in back alleys, but in memory, in every whisper of rebellion, in every refusal to compromise. In every moment a person chooses dignity over convenience, loyalty over gain, courage over comfort, they are there. The last wolves of Kyoto may have fallen, but their howl echoes still. Follow or subscribe the channel to keep their legacy and stories like their say live. This isn't the end. It never is. Not for legends,